Bedtime Reading. The Three Musketeers. Chapter 1. Leaving Home. D'Artagnan did not come from a rich family. When it was his time to leave home and find his fortune in the world, his father only had a few things to give him. The first thing his father gave him was a strange yellow horse. That horse would cause D'Artagnan a lot of trouble in the future. The second thing his father gave him was a letter to Mr. Tréville, his old friend. This letter would help D'Artagnan find work in Paris. Finally, the old man gave his son 15 gold pieces and this advice.
"My son," he began, "you must now leave your family and go out into the world to find fortune and fame. In the world today, men become rich by using bravery and their skill with a sword. Take this letter to my old friend, Mr. Tréville. He will help you. Listen to Mr. Tréville's words and do what he says. Mr. Tréville is a great example to follow. When he was your age, he left home for Paris to make his fortune. Now, he is a powerful and famous man. He is the captain of the Musketeers who guard our great king. Take this letter to him and ask him for work. Work hard and work with honor, my son."
D'Artagnan took the letter and the gold pieces and went to see his mother. His mother loved her only son and would miss him greatly. But she did not show her tears. She told him to stay safe and gave him a bottle of medicine, which could heal all but death wounds. D'Artagnan kissed her goodbye and jumped on his yellow horse. On the first Monday of April, 1626, D'Artagnan arrived at the city of Meung. The people in the town watched him ride by on his strange horse. A few young women waved at him from their high windows. D'Artagnan was a tall and strong young man. His face was thin and brave, and his eyes were dark and deep. Though he was only 19, he was already quite handsome. D'Artagnan was from the town of Gascony. The men of Gascony are famous for being brave when faced with danger, and sometimes for having violent moods. He stared into the eyes of the people on the street fiercely. Eventually, he arrived at an inn and jumped down from his horse. He heard a loud sound of laughter. D'Artagnan turned quickly around on his feet and stared where he had heard the sound. There was a window open on the first floor. A man was sitting by the window. He looked about 30 years old, his eyes were sharp and black, and his skin was dark. D'Artagnan saw that the man had a large scar cut into his face above his black beard. There were 2 men sitting next to him. They were both quite large, and they were listening to the scarred man's words with great concentration. The stranger was staring at D'Artagnan's yellow horse. He then pointed at the horse, smiled, and said something that made his friends again laugh loudly. D'Artagnan was quickly filled with anger. He reached down and grasped the handle of his sword and moved towards the window. He pointed at the stranger.
"You, sir,"
he loudly said.
"Tell me what you men are laughing at, and we can laugh together." "I was not speaking to you, sir,"
the man coldly replied.
"But I was speaking to you,"
cried D'Artagnan. The stranger looked at him with small eyes. He then stood up and came out of the inn.
"Your horse,"
he said,
"must have been born a flower. Yellow flowers are quite common, but yellow certainly is a strange color for a horse."
The man turned around again and moved a step back towards the inn. D'Artagnan pulled his sword out and yelled,
"Turn around, funny sir, or will I have to strike you from behind?"
The stranger turned around quickly and stared at the young man, feeling both surprised and angry. He exclaimed,
"Strike me? You must be crazy."
D'Artagnan became angrier at the man's words and jumped violently at the stranger with his sword. The stranger was fast with his sword and pulled it out before D'Artagnan could hit him. The stranger's friends rushed out of the inn, carrying bats and sticks. They jumped on D'Artagnan and attacked him from all sides at the same time. One of the stranger's servants hit D'Artagnan's sword and broke it into 2 pieces. Then a second man hit D'Artagnan on his head, and he fell to the ground, unconscious. The inn owner looked down at D'Artagnan's body and asked the stranger what to do with him.
"Take him inside and cure his wounds,"
the stranger said coldly.
"When he wakes up, put him on his yellow horse and tell him to go back to where he came from."
The inn owner raised his hand up, and 2 of his servants came over and carried D'Artagnan inside. The stranger went back inside and sat back down with his friends. A bit later, the inn owner returned and asked the stranger if he had been hurt. The stranger smiled.
"Not at all,"
he said.
"Is the crazy young man awake yet?" "He awoke for just a moment before,"
replied the inn owner.
"He said, 'I will tell Mr. Treville of this insult to his old friend's son.' Then the young man fell unconscious again." "Treville?"
the stranger said quietly.
"I searched his pockets,"
said the inn owner.
"There was a letter in one of them to Mr. Treville in Paris." "Did you take the letter out of his coat?" "No, I put it back into his pocket. Not my affair, really. His coat is in the kitchen. If this crazy young man annoys you, I can—" "He annoys me greatly. Now, prepare my horse at once."
The inn owner quickly left the room. The stranger said quietly to himself,
"I am curious to know what is written in this letter to Treville."
He stood up and walked quietly into the kitchen. D'Artagnan's coat was lying on a chair. The stranger grasped the letter and again stepped quickly out of the room. Chapter 2. The Missing Letter. D'Artagnan did not awake until evening. He saw the inn owner sitting above him when he opened his eyes. The inn owner coldly and angrily said,
"Young man, you have caused me a lot of trouble. Though you are weak, you should leave here immediately. Come on, get up."
His head still hurting and not yet awake, D'Artagnan stood up and walked down the inn stairs. He forgot to get his coat or even put on his boots. He looked out of the window on the first floor and saw the stranger standing beside a carriage and talking to a woman inside. He called the woman my lady. D'Artagnan could see that my lady was quite young and very beautiful. "What are the cardinal's orders?" she asked the stranger.
"You must go at once to England,"
the stranger replied,
"and send a letter to the cardinal as soon as the Duke leaves London."
"Is there anything else?" asked my lady.
"The rest of your instructions are in this box. Do not open it until you arrive safely in England. I shall now return to Paris."
"What? What about punishing that rude boy from Gascony?" The stranger was about to answer when D'Artagnan rushed out of the inn, yelling fiercely,
"This rude boy from Gascony will punish you first, as you will soon see."
The stranger turned around quickly, and his hand flew to the handle of his sword. Before he pulled it out, my lady called out, "Don't waste time fighting! Remember that we must move quickly to succeed."
"You are right, as always, milady,"
he said.
"Let's go."
He jumped up onto his horse, while my lady told her carriage driver to ready the horses. The inn owner ran outside and yelled,
"Wait a moment. You still haven't paid for your room and food." "Pay him,"
the stranger ordered his servant. The servant rudely threw 3 pieces of silver on the ground at the inn owner's feet, jumped on his own horse, and rode off with his master.
"You are a coward,"
yelled D'Artagnan, running after the stranger, but his head became dizzy and he fell down to his knees.
"Yes, he is a true coward,"
said the inn owner angrily, as he picked the silver coins off the ground. D'Artagnan then said quietly,
"Though he was truly a coward, the lady was truly beautiful." "Who?"
asked the landlord.
"Milady, the woman in the carriage,"
D'Artagnan said weakly, and again fell unconscious on the ground.
"Well,"
said the landlord,
2 customers have left me, but it looks like one will stay, and I believe he will be here for at least a few more days."
The inn owner did not know the strength of D'Artagnan. The next morning, D'Artagnan got up at dawn. He came down into the kitchen and got his mother's medicine from his coat. He put it on his wound, and it cured instantly. That same night, D'Artagnan was already walking around the town, and the next morning he was already strong enough to continue riding to Paris. When D'Artagnan went to pay his bill, he noticed that his gold was still in his pocket, but his father's letter was missing. D'Artagnan screamed out loudly and promised to heaven that he would destroy the whole inn if his letter were not found. He reached for his sword, but forgot that the stranger's servant had already broken it.
"Where is my letter?"
he screamed, like a lion ready to attack.
"It is for Mr. Treville, and if it is lost, he will want to know why." "Is there anything of high value in it?"
the inn owner asked.
"Anything of high value? My whole fortune is in that letter,"
shouted D'Artagnan angrily.
"Wait,"
cried the inn owner.
"I think I know. Your letter was not lost, it was stolen. I saw the man with the scar on his face go into the kitchen where your coat was. He could have stolen it." "Do you think he did?"
asked D'Artagnan.
"I'm almost sure,"
continued the inn owner.
"I had seen the letter in your pocket when I was curing you. When I told the man that you were a friend of Mr. Treville, he looked very worried. Right after I told him, I saw him go into the kitchen. Then he must be the thief,"
said D'Artagnan.
"I will go to tell Mr. Treville of this affair. Even the king himself shall hear of it."
After saying this, D'Artagnan jumped on his horse and rode off towards Paris. When he arrived in the city, he sold his strange horse to a merchant. He then began walking towards the palace on foot, carrying his bags with him. That night he slept in an inn in the center of the city, near the king's palace. The next morning he went out and bought a new set of clothes and a new sword. He then bathed and fixed his hair. When he was finally happy with his appearance, he set out to see Mr. Treville, the 3rd most powerful person in France. Chapter 3. Meeting Mr. Treville. Mr. Treville, like young D'Artagnan, had left home when quite young to find his fortune in the world. He had come to Paris without money or connections. The only thing he brought with him was his bravery, great skill with a sword, and a quick mind. After many years, his fame grew, and, eventually, he became one of the king's most trusted servants. Louis XIII trusted Mr. Treville perhaps even more than he trusted the Prime Minister or even his own wife. He made Treville the captain of his guards, the Musketeers. Mr. Treville was the third most powerful man in France at this time. Cardinal Richelieu was the second. He was Prime Minister of France. Cardinal Richelieu had great influence with the king, who listened to his advice closely. Both the king and the cardinal had a group of armed bodyguards. The two men were both very competitive, and they each tried to find the best swordsman. The king's guards were called the Musketeers. They were all brave men who did not fear death. Richelieu's men were called simply the cardinal's guards. The cardinal needed loyal guards because he had many powerful enemies. One of his enemies was the Queen, Anne of Austria. She feared the cardinal's power and his influence over her husband, the king. The second was Mr. Treville. He would often have his musketeers train in front of the cardinal's house to show off their strength. This always made the cardinal red with anger. D'Artagnan found his way to the musketeers' camp early that day. The camp was full of men, all wearing the traditional uniform of the musketeers. They all carried swords and were standing in groups talking and laughing. D'Artagnan moved through the crowd in the courtyard and entered the large building at the end. He went through a large door and found himself in a large hall filled with swordsmen. He walked down the hall, feeling very excited and a little nervous. At the end of the hall was a stair, and D'Artagnan hurried up them. He asked the way to Mr. Treville's room and was brought into a waiting room. An older musketeer came over and asked him what he wanted. D'Artagnan told him, and the musketeer nodded his head. While he was waiting, D'Artagnan looked around the room and listened to a group of musketeers talking. He was shocked to hear that they were all telling jokes about Cardinal Richelieu. D'Artagnan's father had said that the cardinal was a great man and had taught his son to have respect for him. Strangely, the musketeers spoke loudly about his bent legs and funny face, and made plans to annoy his guards. D'Artagnan's eyes then spotted a very tall musketeer. He was as big as a mountain, with a proud face and huge, strong hands. He was wearing a beautiful sword belt made of gold and a long purple cloak.
"Where did you get your wonderful belt, Porthos?"
a musketeer asked.
"I had it made especially for me,"
replied Porthos, touching his thick mustache.
"I paid a lot of money for it, didn't I, Aramis?"
The musketeer whom he called Aramis was a young man. His skin was darker than most people, and he had black eyes, a little beard, and a small mustache. He did not seem to speak much and laughed quietly. To answer his friend's question, he only nodded his head. A servant then came out of Mr. Treville's room.
"Mr. Treville will now see Mr. d'Artagnan,"
he cried. Every one in the room became silent as D'Artagnan walked across the room. All the musketeers watched him. Mr. Treville, the captain of the musketeers, was standing by an open window. He was very tall and strong and had thick gray hair. He turned around and looked at D'Artagnan.
"Please, wait a moment,"
Treville said, and walked over to the door.
"Athos?"
he shouted loudly.
Porthos! Aramis, come in here.
The two musketeers whom d'Artagnan had seen in the waiting-room came in. Mr. Tréville walked around the room for a minute and then stopped suddenly in front of them and stared at each of them with eyes as sharp as swords.
Yesterday evening I had dinner with the king. Do you know what he said to me?
He shouted angrily.
No, sir,
answered Porthos.
We do not know. He said that in the future he planned to choose his guards from among the cardinal's men. Use the cardinal's men?
Cried Porthos angrily.
Why? Because his musketeers are weak cowards, it seems,
said Tréville seriously. Both musketeers' faces turned red.
The king was right,
yelled Tréville, staring at them.
Last night some of the musketeers made trouble in an inn, and the cardinal's guards had to arrest them. Arrest musketeers. They are supposed to make peace in the city, not trouble. You were there. You, Aramis. Why do you wear a musketeer uniform when you would look better wearing dirty rags? And Porthos, why do you need such a wonderful gold belt to carry such a useless sword? And Athos, where is Athos? Sir,
answered Aramis sadly.
He is very sick. Sick? What's wrong with him? He may have smallpox, sir,
said Porthos sadly.
Smallpox? Not possible. Perhaps he was wounded or killed last night in the inn, but he certainly does not have smallpox. My God! My musketeers will not fight in the streets and will not be laughed at by the cardinal and his guards. Would the cardinal's guards allow themselves to be arrested? They would die before they were arrested. But you ran away from them. Now the whole city is saying that the king's musketeers are cowards. Captain,
cried Porthos,
the truth is that it was not a fair fight. There were 6 musketeers and 6 of the cardinal's guards, but they attacked us by surprise. They killed 2 musketeers and wounded Athos before we even pulled out our swords. Athos tried to stand up, but could not, so the guards left him there, thinking that he would die. They captured us, but we escaped once we got outside. I did not know that they had surprised you like that,
said Tréville, with some kindness in his voice.
Sir, please, do not tell the king that Athos is hurt.
Aramis said quickly.
Athos is too embarrassed and does not want his majesty to hear of it.
There was then a knock on the door. The door opened, and a tall musketeer entered the room. He had a strong and proud face, but it was also very pale and showing great pain.
Athos!
cried Tréville.
You have asked for me, sir?
Athos said weakly. Tréville jumped quickly towards him.
Yes, I wanted to say that I don't want my musketeers risking their lives without a good reason,
he said.
You are a brave man, Athos, and you are important to the king, who knows that his musketeers are the bravest men in France. Give me your hand, Athos.
Mr. Tréville held the musketeer's hand tightly. Athos became even whiter and fell to the floor unconscious.
Get a doctor, quickly,
cried Tréville. The doctor said that Athos definitely would not die, but that he had lost a lot of blood and would be weak for many days. Some other musketeers came in the room and took Athos out. His friends followed him. Finally, d'Artagnan was alone with Mr. Tréville.
What do you want?
asked Tréville sharply. D'Artagnan repeated his name, and Mr. Tréville remembered him at once.
I am sorry,
he said.
I had forgotten you. Your father and I were good friends. How can I help you? I came to ask,
D'Artagnan said carefully,
if you would allow me the honor of wearing the uniform of a musketeer. In the short time I have been here in Paris, I have already seen what a great honor that is." "You are right,"
agreed Treville.
"It is a very great honor. No one can become a musketeer until he has shown that he has uncommon courage,"
he said.
"Since your father was my good friend,"
continued Treville,
"I will do what I can to help you. I will write a letter to the director of the Royal Academy. Tomorrow you can begin studying how to use a sword and ride a horse. I will make sure that you can study without any expense to yourself. Come to see me every few months and tell me about your progress."
D'Artagnan was feeling very disappointed. He felt that Treville was acting a little cold. Without thinking, he quickly cried out,
"I can ride and fight already. If only you could see the letter that my father wrote you. I had one, sir, but it was stolen from me."
D'Artagnan then told Mr. Treville about the stranger at the inn in Meung. Mr. Treville looked very interested and said,
"You said that the man who stole your letter had a large scar on his face, yes?" "Yes, sir, on his left cheek,"
said D'Artagnan excitedly.
"This is very strange,"
said Treville seriously.
"Do you know this man?"
asked D'Artagnan.
"Tell me where I can find him."
Treville looked serious and troubled.
"Listen to my advice, young man,"
he said with a very serious face.
"Do not look for that man. He is quite dangerous."
He then turned away from D'Artagnan and sat down at his desk.
"I will write that letter for you."
As he waited for Treville to finish writing, D'Artagnan stood by the window and looked out into the streets of Paris. Treville finished writing the letter and was about to give it to D'Artagnan, when suddenly the young man was seen running towards the door, yelling loudly.
"He will not escape this time." Who won't escape?"
asked Treville, standing up shocked.
"The man who stole my letter,"
replied D'Artagnan while running down the stairs.
"I just saw him in the street."
Before Mr. Treville could stop him, D'Artagnan was down the stairs. Chapter 4. 3 Duels. As D'Artagnan ran down the stairs, he ran into a large musketeer who was just coming out of another room. The man yelled out in pain and stared down at D'Artagnan.
"Excuse me,"
D'Artagnan said without stopping.
"It is important that I move quickly."
Before D'Artagnan could walk 3 steps, a strong hand grasped his belt and pulled him back. D'Artagnan turned around quickly and saw that the injured musketeer Athos was holding him. The man was as white as snow.
"Sir,"
said Athos, taking his hand off D'Artagnan's belt,
"you are not polite. I can see that you are not from the city."
D'Artagnan had already begun to turn around and run. But when Athos said these words, he stopped and walked back up to him.
"Though I am from the country,"
he replied,
"I don't think that a man like you can give me lessons in good manners. If I were not running to catch someone, I would—" "Mr. Man without manners,"
Athos interrupted calmly,
"you can find me without running after me. Where, may I ask?" "I will be behind the Carmelite church at noon, just me and my sword." "I will be there also,"
said D'Artagnan.
"Try not to be late. That would be polite,"
said Athos calmly.
"I promise you that a few minutes after noon I shall cut your ears off as you run. We will see who runs,"
D'Artagnan replied, and he turned and began running down the stairs again. He ran as fast as he could across the courtyard towards the door. Porthos was talking with another musketeer in front of the door. Between the 2 musketeers, There was just enough room for d'Artagnan to pass through. But as d'Artagnan jumped between them, the wind blew Porthos' long cloak open. D'Artagnan ran straight into the cloak and fell down to the ground, pulling Porthos with him. As the two men stood up, d'Artagnan saw that Porthos' fancy sword belt was fake. The front side was covered with gold, but the back was nothing but common iron. Porthos stood up and fixed his cloak and belt, and then turned to d'Artagnan and said,
"You must be crazy to run into people like this."
D'Artagnan's head bowed a little, and he said, out of breath,
"Excuse me, I am in a great hurry. I need to catch someone who—" "Do you always close your eyes when you are running?"
interrupted Porthos angrily.
"Of course not,"
replied d'Artagnan, annoyed.
"In fact, my eyes let me see what most other people cannot."
Porthos became even angrier and walked a step toward d'Artagnan.
"I'll see you later,"
said the young d'Artagnan as he began to run again.
"And I'll cut off your cloak and belt with my sword. At 1 o'clock behind the Carmelite church,"
Porthos yelled after him.
"Very well, 1 o'clock,"
replied d'Artagnan, and ran out into the street. The street was empty, because of running into Athos and Porthos. D'Artagnan had missed his chance to catch the stranger. He began walking down the street looking for him, but he was gone. D'Artagnan recognized Aramis standing farther down the street, chatting with a group of friends. He decided to go over and talk with him. Aramis saw d'Artagnan approaching, but he remembered that this young man had seen Mr. Tréville be angry at him, so he pretended that he did not see him. D'Artagnan walked up smiling and bowed deeply. Aramis nodded his head a little, but did not smile. His group of friends all immediately stopped talking. D'Artagnan realized quickly that they did not want to talk with him. He tried to think of the least embarrassing way of leaving the situation. He then looked down and saw that Aramis had dropped his handkerchief and was standing on it. D'Artagnan reached down and pulled the handkerchief from under Aramis' shoe.
"I believe, sir, that you dropped your handkerchief,"
D'Artagnan said politely. D'Artagnan saw that the handkerchief was small and yellow. It did not look like a man's handkerchief. Aramis' face turned red, and he pulled the handkerchief out of D'Artagnan's hand, but not before his group of friends saw the writing on it.
"Aha!"
cried one of his friends.
"You and Madame de Chevreuse must be good friends, if she lends you her handkerchief."
Aramis stared at D'Artagnan angrily, and then said lightly,
"This handkerchief is not mine, sir. You see, mine is here in my pocket."
D'Artagnan realized that he had made a terrible mistake. He walked away and waited for Aramis' friends to leave. Then he came back towards Aramis and said,
"Sir, please excuse me. I did not know—" "Young man,"
Aramis replied seriously,
"you have not acted like a gentleman." "What?"
cried D'Artagnan.
"I was trying to help. I believe that you are not a fool, and that you understand that people stand on handkerchiefs for a reason. Why did you hand it to me publicly, so that a fine lady's name was shown to everyone around? It seems like I need to teach you how to act."
D'Artagnan's right hand grasped the handle of his sword.
"Not here in public, you fool,"
said Aramis in a voice like a snake's.
"I shall wait for you behind the Carmelite church. At 2 o'clock,
replied D'Artagnan sharply.
"I suggest that you bring that handkerchief. Whether it belongs to you or a lady, you will need it to stop your blood from flowing."
The two men bowed to each other and walked away. D'Artagnan, knowing that noon was close, began walking to the church. At this time, it was the custom in France that men fighting a duel would each bring 2 friends, called seconds, with them to the meeting place. They did this so that, if they died, their friends could carry their body home. Since D'Artagnan had just arrived in Paris, he had no friends there. He went to the duel alone. Athos was already at the church, and waited in the middle of a grassy field for D'Artagnan. The church sat at one end of the field, and there was forest around the rest.
"My seconds have not come yet,"
said Athos.
"but they should arrive soon." "I do not have seconds, sir, for I do not yet have any friends in Paris,"
D'Artagnan explained. Athos looked carefully at the young man.
"I feel sorry that I must kill a man as young as you,"
he said.
"Do not worry about that,"
answered D'Artagnan,
"since you honor me by fighting while you are injured badly. The wound is painful."
Athos agreed.
"But I must tell you that I fight as well with my left hand as my right. Ah, I see my friends coming."
D'Artagnan turned around and saw Aramis and Porthos coming.
"These are your seconds?"
he said, shocked.
"Of course they are,"
replied Athos. His face was surprised.
"We are always together. Don't you know that the people of Paris call us the Three Musketeer brothers?"
By this time, Porthos and Aramis had come close enough to see D'Artagnan. They stood there looking quite shocked.
"What does this mean? Who is this man to you?"
asked Porthos.
"This is the man I am going to fight,"
answered Athos.
"What?"
Porthos cried, amazed.
"He is the man I am fighting as well." "Yes,"
said D'Artagnan.
"but not until 1 o'clock. This is not possible,"
said Aramis.
"He is the man who I plan to duel. Our duel is not until 2 o'clock.
D'Artagnan said calmly.
Mr. Athos has the first duel and the right to kill me first. He may even do so now. Now, Mr. Athos, prepare your sword."
The two men bowed deeply to each other and pulled out their swords. But just as they touched their swords together, they heard the sound of horses quickly running. Suddenly, 5 horsemen came out of the forest along the field's east side and rode straight toward the musketeers.
"It's the Cardinal's guards,"
Aramis cried.
"Put down your swords quickly."
But it was already too late. The horsemen had already seen Athos and D'Artagnan fighting. Even now, the sunlight was shining off their swords brightly. The horsemen stopped about 30 steps from them.
"My God, it's Captain Jussac himself,"
said Porthos. The captain rode forward. He was tall and wore dark clothes. D'Artagnan stared at him with great interest. Jussac looked angry as he came closer, but he had a strange smile on his face.
"Fighting again, are you?"
he said loudly.
"You all know that dueling is not allowed by law. It is my job to stop you. Put down your swords and follow me."
Aramis smiled.
"Sir,"
he said, copying Jussac's loud and serious voice,
"we cannot put down our swords or follow you. You know that Mr. Treville wouldn't like us to be arrested. Please, leave now and let us handle our own affairs. If you disobey, we will have to use our swords to stop you,"
said Jussac.
"There are 5 of them and 3 of us,"
whispered Athos.
"I think we can win."
Athos, Porthos, and Aramis quickly moved close together. Jussac raised his hand to prepare his men for battle. D'Artagnan then stepped towards the musketeers.
"Gentlemen,"
he said with a smile,
"we are not 3, but 4. You are not one of us."
said Porthos.
"I may not have the uniform of a musketeer,"
replied d'Artagnan,
"but I have the heart and spirit of one. You are a brave man,"
Athos said as he grasped d'Artagnan's hand.
"What is your name, sir?" "It's D'Artagnan, sir." "Well, then, Athos, Porthos, Aramis, and D'Artagnan. Attack!"
cried Athos. Immediately they each pulled out their swords. The 4 swords shined bright in the sunlight. Jussac and his men jumped down from their horses and drew their swords. For a moment they stood staring at d'Artagnan and the musketeers. Then they ran at them with loud, violent yells. 2 men attacked Aramis at once, while d'Artagnan jumped forward to fight Jussac. D'Artagnan fought like a tiger, jumping at the older man on all sides and making quick stabs with his sword. Jussac was a very experienced swordsman, but he quickly found that it took all his skill to defend himself against d'Artagnan's attack. He was used to men who fought with traditional sword styles, but d'Artagnan's method seemed to disobey all of the rules. As Jussac became tired, he made one great jump and aimed a terrible stab at d'Artagnan's heart. D'Artagnan blocked his attack and, while Jussac was recovering, pulled a knife out from his belt and pushed it through his enemy's body. He fell to the ground heavily, with a loud yell of pain. D'Artagnan quickly turned around and looked around the field with worry. He saw that Aramis had killed one of the 2 guards who attacked him and was still fighting with the second. Porthos had stabbed his enemy in the leg and, in return, had been stabbed in his arm. Neither wound was serious, and the 2 fought even harder. The wounded Athos was fighting bravely, but his face was very pale and he was weak. D'Artagnan jumped to help him, yelling to the cardinal's guard,
"Face towards me, Sir Guard, or I will have to kill you."
The guard quickly turned around to fight d'Artagnan, and at that very moment Athos fell down onto one knee.
"Do not kill that man, D'Artagnan,"
Athos asked.
"He is the one who wounded me before, and I wish to kill him myself. Just take away his sword."
D'Artagnan easily hit the sword out of the guard's hand.
"Good work,"
Athos said when he saw the man's sword fly out of his hand. The guard immediately ran over to the guard whom Aramis had killed, grasped his sword, and ran back towards d'Artagnan. On his way back, he met Athos, who had again stood up and wished to continue fighting. The guard jumped at Athos, believing that he was weak and easy to defeat. With one quick movement of his arm, Athos lifted his sword and pushed it through the guard's neck. Just at that moment, Aramis hit the sword away from his enemy and pushed him down on the ground. He held his sword to the guard's throat and made him beg for mercy. Now only Porthos was still fighting. His enemy seemed to be a very skilled swordsman, perhaps as skilled as Porthos himself. Before they could finish their fight, the wounded Jussac told the guard to stop. The man quickly jumped back, broke his sword into 2 pieces over his knee so that he would not have to give it to Porthos. He then threw the pieces over the church wall and stood staring at Porthos and the other musketeers. The musketeers always respected bravery, even in their enemies. They bowed to him, then they all helped him to carry the wounded and dead guards to the church, and then began walking back to the base of the musketeers. The 4 men walked together arm in arm, and each time they saw a musketeer, they took him in also. Soon the whole street was filled with musketeers, so, in the end, their walk became a walk of victory. D'Artagnan walked between Athos and Porthos in the front of the group, and his heart almost exploded with joy. Chapter 5. Meeting the King. News in Paris traveled quickly, and soon everyone was talking about the fight between the Musketeers and the Cardinal's guards. Mr. Treville scolded Athos, Porthos, and Aramis in public, but in private he praised and congratulated them. He decided that he should hurry to the palace to tell the king of the battle before the cardinal did. When he arrived at the palace, he found the king winning at cards. He was clearly in a very good mood.
"Come over here, Captain Treville,"
the king called.
"Did you know that the cardinal has been complaining about your men again? Ha ha! These musketeers of yours should almost be put in prison." "No, sire,"
answered Treville.
"They are good and strong men, and their only desire is to serve their king. But the cardinal's guards are always causing fights with them. My men can do nothing but defend themselves." "How did the fight happen?"
the king asked, still looking at his cards.
3 of my best men, Athos, Porthos, and Aramis, had arranged to meet a young man from Gascony behind the church. Then 5 of the cardinal's guards rode up on horses. I'm sure you can guess what 5 armed men on horses planned to do there. "It is clear,"
said the king, nodding his head.
"They must have gone there to start a fight. You are right, Captain Treville. They thought that my 3 musketeers had gone there alone, and they knew that Athos was weak from a deep wound. They must have believed that they would be easy to defend. You are right again, Treville. But I hear that your musketeers were helped by a young man from Gascony." "Yes, sire, you have heard correctly. 2 healthy musketeers, 1 wounded musketeer, and 1 young man were forced to defend themselves against 5 of the cardinal's professional swordsmen, and they won. Why, this is an amazing victory,"
cried the king, his eyes bright with excitement.
"Tell me about this young man." "He is the only son of one of my oldest friends. His name is D'Artagnan. He was the one who defeated Jussac and gave him the terrible wound which made the cardinal so angry." "The young man wounded Jussac? Jussac is one of the most skilled swordsmen in France." "Captain Treville, that's not possible." "It is true, sire." "I would like to meet this young man from Gascony, Treville. He has shown great bravery. It seems that he could join our musketeers. What do you think?"
Treville thought for a minute, and then said,
"He comes from one of France's best families, and his courage is great. I believe that he would serve you as a musketeer to the death. Then bring him to meet me tomorrow at noon, and bring the other 3 also. I would like to reward them for their uncommon courage."
Treville smiled, bowed deeply to the king, and left to tell the musketeers of the great honor that waited for them. When D'Artagnan heard that he was going to meet the king, he became so excited that he could not eat or sleep. The next day D'Artagnan dressed in his best clothes and followed Athos, Porthos, and Aramis as they entered the king's great hall.
"Come forward, my brave men,"
said the king. He smiled softly at the 4 of them.
"I must scold you,"
he said while laughing. The musketeers walked forward, with D'Artagnan walking closely behind them.
"God in heaven,"
continued the king,
"the cardinal lost 4 of his guards in one day. If you men keep acting this way, poor Cardinal Richelieu will not have any men left in 2 weeks' time. Sire, my men have come to ask you to forgive their actions,"
said Treville, smiling.
"Looking at the happiness in their faces, I doubt that,"
the king replied with a laugh.
"Treville, you told me yesterday that the man from Gascony was quite young. I can see now that he is still a boy, and yet you say that he defeated Jussac. It is true, my king.
The king then insisted that D'Artagnan himself tell him the story of his fight with Jussac. He listened with great pleasure. He then turned to Athos, Porthos, and Aramis.
It seems you have had your revenge for the other day in the inn,
he said.
Let this revenge be the end of your fighting with the cardinal's guards, gentlemen. You should all be satisfied now. If you are satisfied, sire,
said Tréville,
then we are also.
The king smiled.
I would like to show my great satisfaction,
he said. He then turned to Athos.
Tell me,
he began,
do you and your friends still plan to fight with Mr. d'Artagnan?
Athos looked shocked.
Of course not, my king,
he replied.
He has become one of us. Beginning today, we shall be known as the Four Musketeer Brothers.
The king then turned to Tréville.
Well, Captain Tréville,
he said,
it looks like you should make young D'Artagnan a musketeer.
Chapter 6. Mr. Bonacieux. The king rewarded D'Artagnan with some money before he left. On the way out of the palace, Athos, Porthos, and Aramis told him that he should hire a servant, and they found him a young man named Planchet from Picardy. Mr. Tréville also had a gift for D'Artagnan, a musketeer uniform that fit him perfectly, and a new sword. The next day, D'Artagnan entered the musketeers' station and walked round with his friends, as if he had been a musketeer for months already. For the next few weeks, life was calm and happy. The four men became good friends and spent the days practicing their sword skills and the evening talking together. Then one afternoon, D'Artagnan heard a strange knock at his door. He opened the door and saw a short and fat man with a round face and round eyes.
Mr. d'Artagnan,
the man began,
everyone in Paris knows that you are a young man of uncommon courage. I have come here to ask for your help. My help?
D'Artagnan said, feeling a little bit surprised.
The problem is with my niece, sir. Her name is Constance, and she works in the palace for the queen. She makes clothing.
The little man's face then became quite sad.
Yesterday morning she was attacked by some men and carried off as she was walking home. But what kind of man would attack a young woman?
Asked D'Artagnan.
I am not certain who did it, but I believe I know someone who might want to capture her. There is a man who works for Cardinal Richelieu. He knows that Constance is a close friend with the queen. I think he captured her, hoping to discover the king and queen's secrets. The cardinal believes that the queen is helping England and Spain against our country. He has told this to the king and has made him very nervous about his wife. The queen has had a very hard life because of the cardinal. Sir, how do you know all this about the affairs of the palace?
D'Artagnan asked.
My niece told me, sir. She has also told me that recently someone has made a plan to trap the queen. The queen learned that someone has written a letter using the queen's name to the Duke of Buckingham in England, asking him to come to France. The Duke has great respect for the queen and will certainly come quickly to Paris. When he does, he will be trapped by the queen's enemies, and then people will believe that the queen was going to help England against France. I still don't understand why someone would capture your niece. They know that the queen trusts my niece and could use her to learn the queen's secrets, or even could use her as a spy. That may be so.
D'Artagnan agreed.
Who do you think captured your niece? I don't know his name. I only know that he is a tall and dark-skinned man with a proud face, black hair, and a large scar on one cheek. Tall, dark, a large scar on his cheek. I know that man. He is the man I met in Meung.
D'Artagnan yelled as he quickly jumped to his feet.
If this was the man who captured your niece, then a stab from my sword will give us both our revenge. Where can I find this man? I don't know. No ideas?
D'Artagnan cried.
Is that all you know? Yes. Oh, and this morning I received this letter.
He pulled a letter from his pocket and handed it to D'Artagnan. Only 2 sentences were written on the letter.
Do not try and find your niece. If you do, we will kill her and you also. This letter was only written to scare you,
D'Artagnan said.
I know, sir. However, I am truly scared. I am not skilled with a sword, and I could be put in prison. I understand, Mr. My name is Bonacieux,
the man said with a bow.
I own this building and live in the rooms below you. I have seen you walking around with those 3 musketeers, who I know do not like Cardinal Richelieu. So I thought you might be willing to help our poor queen, my niece, and make trouble for the cardinal at the same time. I certainly would,
D'Artagnan said with a smile.
I thought I could offer you this bag of silver to help with your expenses.
Mr. Bonacieux said.
This is quite a large bag,
said D'Artagnan, receiving the silver happily.
You must be a very rich man, Mr. Bonacieux. Well, you could say that I am doing quite well, sir. Recently my business has...
He suddenly stopped talking and ran to the window.
Look,
he yelled, his eyes wide with surprise.
Out there in the street. It's the man with the scar.
D'Artagnan ran to the window also.
It is him,
he cried, recognizing the man of Meung.
This time he will not escape.
He grasped his sword and ran out of the door. As he jumped down the stairs, he met Athos, Porthos, and Aramis, who were coming to visit him.
Move!
D'Artagnan yelled as he ran between them.
What are you doing?
Porthos yelled as he passed.
It's the man of Meung,
D'Artagnan replied without stopping his run. D'Artagnan had told them about his fight in Meung, so they understood what he meant. They did not understand why he wanted to find this man so much, so they continued walking up the stairs. D'Artagnan got down to the street, but, again, he was too late. The man of Meung had disappeared. When D'Artagnan returned home, he found his 3 friends waiting for him. Mr. Bonacieux was gone, but D'Artagnan told the other musketeers of the little man's trouble.
A young woman has been attacked and carried off,
D'Artagnan finished saying.
This girl is now in prison, perhaps even being hurt. Only because she is loyal to the queen, I must help save her.
Suddenly, they heard the loud sounds of feet rushing up the stairs. The door was opened with a violent sound, and Mr. Bonacieux ran into the room. His eyes were wild and full of fear.
Help me,
he yelled.
4 of the cardinal's guards have come to arrest me.
The 4 guards ran into the room after him, but, seeing the 4 musketeers with swords on their belts, they stopped.
Come in, gentlemen,
D'Artagnan said in a calm voice.
We are all loyal to the king and cardinal. Then you will not stop us in our work?
The leader of the guards asked, looking calmer, knowing that he would not have to fight with the famous musketeers.
Of course not,
replied D'Artagnan. Mr. Bonacieux stared at D'Artagnan with deep anger in his eyes.
You promised that you would help me,
he whispered.
We can only help save you and your niece if we are free ourselves,
D'Artagnan whispered back.
Do not worry, I will do what I promised.
Then D'Artagnan said loudly to the guards,
I have no reason to protect this man. I met him for the first time today when he came to collect the rent. He wants too much money for this small room, and I shall be happy to see him in prison."
The 4 guards all laughed with d'Artagnan. They grasped Mr. Bonacieux and pulled him out of the room.
"Why didn't you defend him?"
Porthos cried.
"How could you let a man who has asked for our help to be arrested? Aramis, do you agree with D'Artagnan?" "Yes, I definitely do,"
Aramis replied, and Porthos looked shocked.
"Listen, friends,"
said d'Artagnan, without explaining his actions to Porthos.
"All for one and one for all. This is what we always say, is it not?"
Soon after the guards had arrested Mr. Bonacieux, they moved into his rooms below d'Artagnan's. They made his rooms into a trap. Each time someone would knock on the door, the guards would open it and then close and lock it behind them. All the people who came to see Mr. Bonacieux were kept prisoner until they had told the guards everything that they knew about Bonacieux and his niece. Luckily, d'Artagnan could still come in and out since his room had a separate door and hall. For the next few days, d'Artagnan did not leave his room. He watched out of his window to see what visitors came and left. He also pulled out a piece of wood from his floor, so that he could listen to the conversations between Cardinal's guards and their prisoners below. 3 days after the guards had arrested Bonacieux, d'Artagnan heard a loud knocking at the street door. The door was quickly opened and shut again. Someone was caught. D'Artagnan ran over to his hole in the floor and listened. He could hear the sounds of people struggling. Then a woman's voice cried out, "This is my uncle's home. I am Constance Bonacieux, and I work in the palace for the Queen." D'Artagnan jumped to his feet when he heard this. He called to his servant Planchet.
"Run, quickly,"
he said.
"Go and find Athos, Porthos, and Aramis. Tell them to come here as quickly as possible. I am going to go down to Mr. Bonacieux's house below. I will be caught in the trap, but I will make the guards regret it."
A minute later, d'Artagnan knocked at the street door. The door was opened, and d'Artagnan ran in with his sword in hand into the room. One of the guards reached for his sword, but d'Artagnan stabbed him through the shoulder before he could pull it out. The 2 other soldiers jumped at d'Artagnan with chairs, but d'Artagnan wounded both of them with his sword, and all 3 guards ran out the door. D'Artagnan found Constance Bonacieux lying in a chair, breathing hard. She opened her eyes as d'Artagnan walked toward her. She was a very beautiful young woman. She had dark hair, blue eyes, and a small and perfect nose. She smiled at him. "I have seen you before around the city. You are Mr. d'Artagnan, the musketeer," she said. "You have bravely saved me. How can I thank you?" D'Artagnan bowed deeply.
"Madam,"
he said,
"I do not need any thanks."
"What has happened to my uncle?" she asked in a worried voice.
"I'm sorry to tell you that he has been put in prison,"
d'Artagnan answered. "But why? Has he done anything wrong?"
"He is your uncle, Madame Bonacieux, that is why."
"Oh, I see. You must know about—"
"Yes, I know that you were captured by a tall man with a scar on his face, but I don't know how you escaped."
"I was put in a room on the 3rd floor of a building not very far from the palace. I waited until after dark today and climbed down from the window using the sheets on my bed. I didn't know where to go, so I ran here to find my uncle."
"What can we do now?"
asked d'Artagnan.
"Those men will certainly go and get help. If they come back and find us here, we will certainly be killed. Where can I take you?"
"I don't know, Mr. d'Artagnan," Constance said sadly. "I don't know anybody who I can trust. I wanted to ask my uncle to go to the palace and find Mr. Laporte, who is a loyal helper of the Queen. I need to see him, because I must know what has happened to the Queen since I was captured. I am afraid to go and see the Queen until I am sure that it is safe. But now I have no friends to send."
"You may trust me, madam,"
D'Artagnan said with excitement. "You are truly a brave man, and I believe that I can trust you," said Constance. "Please go to the palace and ask for Mr. Germain. When he asks you what you want, you must answer, 'Travels and Stories.' Then he will ask you what you want again. Tell him that you need to see Mr. Laporte." She then paused and looked worried. "Where can you bring him to meet me?"
"I'll take you now to my friend's room, another musketeer named Athos,"
said D'Artagnan.
"He will be happy to hide you."
They left the house and moved quickly and quietly through the streets of Paris. Finally, they arrived at Athos' house. Just a few minutes later, D'Artagnan arrived at the palace. He told Mr. Laporte where Constance was hiding, and Laporte ran there as quickly as possible. D'Artagnan left the palace and walked along the river, thinking of Constance Bonacieux and how beautiful she was. Suddenly, he remembered that he had sent Planchet to get his friends and that he should explain to them why he did so. He turned around and began walking towards Aramis' home. Just before he arrived at the house, he saw a woman walking quickly ahead of him, wearing a long cloak. The woman stopped in front of Aramis' house and knocked on the window 3 times. A moment later, someone inside knocked 2 times. Then the woman replied by knocking 3 times again, and the window opened. D'Artagnan watched the woman take out a handkerchief from her pocket and show it to the person in the house. He then heard the sound of low voices. D'Artagnan was surprised to see that it was not Aramis inside, but a woman. After a minute the window closed. The woman wearing the long cloak turned around and passed D'Artagnan. She was looking down to hide her face, but D'Artagnan could see that she was Constance Bonacieux. Chapter 7. The Duke of Buckingham. D'Artagnan decided to follow after Constance. After hearing the sound of his footsteps, Constance looked back and saw the dark figure of a man following after her. She screamed with fear and began to run as fast as she could. D'Artagnan ran after her and soon came close enough to grasp her arm. When he did, she screamed and fell down on her knees, crying, "Kill me! Please just kill me! I will tell you nothing!" Then she turned around and looked into D'Artagnan's eyes and cried with happiness. "It is you, dear D'Artagnan," she said. "Have you been following me?"
"No. I came here to see my friend Aramis and saw you knocking on his window."
"Who is Aramis?"
"You certainly must know him. You were just at his house,"
said D'Artagnan. "I've never even heard that name before." "This was the first time that I went to that house," said Constance.
"Didn't you go there to visit him?"
"Certainly not. Didn't you see me speaking to a woman?"
"I don't understand why she was at Aramis's house. Who is she?"
"That is a secret."
"Madame Bonacieux, you are lovely and polite, but you are also full of secrets."
"Perhaps I am," she answered with a smile. "Now, please stop asking so many questions. Instead, you can walk me where I am going."
"Where do you wish to go?"
"I will tell you as we walk. However, you must promise to take me to the door and then leave me, or I will have to ask you to leave now."
"I am a man of honor. You have my promise. Please take my arm and we will go."
They walked for a while to a narrow street where Constance seemed to recognize a small wood door and stop in front of it. "Thank you for all your help, Mr. D'Artagnan," she said. Then she added nervously, "You will not forget your promise, will you?"
"I will leave now,"
said D'Artagnan, bowing to her.
Good night, Madame Bonacieux.
D'Artagnan knew that he was not far from the house of Athos, and he decided to go and visit him. As he walked up the stairs to Athos' room, however, he met his servant Planchet coming down. Planchet looked very worried.
Sir, Mr. Athos was arrested by the cardinal's guards,
said Planchet.
They found him in your room, and they thought that he was you. What? Didn't he tell them his name? No, sir. He wouldn't tell them. Before they grasped him, he whispered to me, D'Artagnan needs to be free now, for he knows everything about this affair. I will tell these guards who I am in 3 days, but until then they will think that they have arrested D'Artagnan. Athos is truly a man of honor,
said D'Artagnan.
But what about Porthos and Aramis? I looked, but could not find them. Did you leave letters at their houses saying that I needed to meet with them? Yes, I did, sir. I see. Then I must ask you to wait here. If they come back, tell them what has happened to Athos. Tell them to meet me at the Pine Tree Inn. I'll run and tell Mr. Tréville all that has happened.
Running as fast as he could, D'Artagnan arrived soon at Tréville's home. Tréville was not there, and his servant told D'Artagnan that he had gone to the palace. D'Artagnan decided to go there at once. Just before arriving at the castle, D'Artagnan saw in front of him a woman wearing a cloak and a man wearing the uniform of a musketeer. He knew at once that the woman was Constance, and he guessed that the man was Aramis, though he could not see clearly because the man was holding a handkerchief in front of his face. D'Artagnan immediately became full of jealousy and anger. He walked forward with quick steps, moving past the two people, and then he turned back around to meet them. The musketeer holding the handkerchief in front of his face moved back a step.
What do you want, sir?
He said angrily. The man spoke in a foreign accent that surprised D'Artagnan.
You are not Aramis,
he cried.
No, sir, I certainly am not,
replied the man.
Since you do not know us, please allow us to pass. Though I do not know you, sir, I know this lady quite well,
D'Artagnan said. You promised not to wait for me or follow me, Constance said in anger.
And you, Madame Bonacieux, told me.
D'Artagnan began, but he was interrupted by the stranger.
Please, take my arm, madam,
he said,
and we will go on our way.
He pushed D'Artagnan to one side with his hand as they walked past. D'Artagnan, filled with anger, jumped back and pulled out his sword. At the same moment, and as fast as lightning, the man pulled out his. Stop! Constance cried, jumping between the two men. Do not fight here, or we will all be destroyed. D'Artagnan put his sword back in his belt and asked,
Tell me who you are, sir, and I will let you pass.
He is the Duke of Buckingham, Constance said angrily, and your foolish actions may possibly cause all of our deaths. Chapter 8. The Man with the Scar.
Sir Duke, Madame Bonacieux, I am truly sorry,
D'Artagnan said respectfully.
But I love this woman, sir, and I became jealous when I saw her with you. Please, excuse my actions. My life is yours to command. Tell me how I may help you.
The Duke of Buckingham smiled and reached out his hand to D'Artagnan.
I can see that you are a brave young man, and I accept your help,
he said.
Follow 30 steps behind us until we enter the palace, and if you see anyone watching us, kill them.
D'Artagnan followed behind them with his hand on the handle of his sword until they entered the palace. Then, Still thinking about this surprising meeting, he walked quickly to the Pine Tree Inn, where he found Aramis and Porthos waiting for him. He began to tell them everything that had happened. Meanwhile, the Duke and Constance had entered the palace. Constance brought the Duke into a small room lit only by a few candles. "Please wait here, sir," she said. "Soon someone will come to see you." She then left the room. Buckingham walked over to a mirror on the wall. He thought that the musketeer's uniform looked quite good on him. He had a strong and proud face, and many people said that he was the most handsome man in England or France. He smiled at the mirror and fixed his hair. The door opened and a woman entered. Buckingham saw her in the mirror and let out a cry of joy. It was the Queen herself. As she walked forward, Buckingham fell down on one knee, grasped her hand lovingly, and kissed it. "You know that the letter you received was fake. I did not send for you," the Queen said without breath.
"Yes, madam,"
replied Buckingham.
"Constance told me, but I am still happy that I have come because now I can see you."
"By coming here," cried the Queen, "you risk your life and my honor. I have come here only to tell you that we can never see each other again."
"I know, and I will go,"
he replied.
"But do not make my trip here all a loss. Please give me something of yours to remember you by, something that you have worn, so that I may always wear it and think of you."
"Will you leave here and go back to England immediately if I give you what you ask?"
"Yes, I promise you that I will leave at once."
"Wait here, then. I will return." The Queen left the room for a minute and came back holding a wood box. She handed it to Buckingham. "Take this," she said softly, "and keep it to remember me." Buckingham fell to his knees and took the box. "Do not forget your promise," the Queen said, with great worry in her voice.
"I shall keep my word. Your hand, madam, and I leave."
The Queen held out her hand and closed her eyes. Buckingham kissed her hand softly and stood up.
"I will see you again, madam, even if I have to fight and change the whole world,"
he said, and left the room. Constance was waiting in the hall and led him away from the palace. Mr. Bonacieux sat locked in prison for 2 days and 3 nights. On the morning of the 3rd day, 2 guards entered his room, followed by an officer.
"Follow me,"
the guard said coldly, and the scared little man followed. The guards opened an old wood door and threw him into a small room. An officer was sitting in front of a small table. The room was quite dark. The officer raised his head and looked up.
"Sit down, Mr. Bonacieux,"
he ordered in a strong voice.
"You are here because of planning against our king." "Sir,"
Bonacieux cried, with tears in his eyes.
"It is not true." "Is it not?"
the officer said angrily.
"I suggest that you quickly tell me the truth. The cardinal is very angry, and you do not want to make him angrier."
Bonacieux's face turned as white as snow.
"I will tell you everything I know,"
he cried.
"Please ask me anything, I beg you." "Very well. First, tell me, where is your niece?" "I don't know, sir, truly. Many days ago she was captured and taken away." "Yes, she was. But yesterday, because of you, she escaped." "Escaped? Sir, I promise, if she has escaped, it is not because of me." "If it is not because of you, then why did you visit the musketeer named D'Artagnan?" "I asked him to help me find my niece. I did not know that she had been arrested. I thought she was captured by thieves, and that I had a duty to find her. If I was wrong, I beg for your mercy." "I will tell you, Mr. Bonacieux. Mr. D'Artagnan attacked the officers who had arrested your niece. He now has hidden her somewhere. Luckily, we have recently found D'Artagnan and arrested him."
The officer yelled to the guard,
"Bring in D'Artagnan!"
A few minutes later, the guards pulled in Athos. Mr. Bonacieux stared at him with shocked eyes.
"This is not Mr. D'Artagnan,"
he yelled out.
"This man does not look anything like him."
The officer looked at Athos.
"Your name?"
he asked seriously.
"Athos. But before you said it was D'Artagnan."
he said angrily.
"I certainly did not. An officer said to me, 'You are Mr. D'Artagnan.' And I answered, 'You think so?' Then your guards said that they were sure that I was D'Artagnan, so I could not argue." "You are free to leave then, mister,"
said the policeman. As Athos walked from the room, the officer turned toward the guards and said angrily,
"Take Mr. Bonacieux back to his room and find the real D'Artagnan."
The guards locked Bonacieux in his prison room again. He waited there until about 9 in the evening, when he heard steps in his hall. The door opened and the guards came in again.
"Follow me,"
said an officer who came in after the guards. Bonacieux was led to a carriage and was driven for almost an hour through the streets of Paris until the carriage stopped before a large door. 2 guards took Bonacieux, now completely pale with fear, up some stairs and into a room filled with maps and books. There was a fire in the room, and a man stood in front of it. He was of middle height and had a thin face with a grey beard and moustache and very powerful eyes.
"Is this Mr. Bonacieux?"
he asked.
"Yes, sir,"
replied the officer at Bonacieux's side.
"Very good. You may leave us now."
The officer and guards left.
"Mr. Bonacieux, you have planned against our king with your niece and the Duke of Buckingham." "Sir, I promise you that I do not know anything about it,"
cried Bonacieux.
"My niece has spoken of the Duke before, but what did she say about him?"
interrupted the man.
"She told me that Cardinal Richelieu had tricked the Duke of Buckingham into coming to France, so that he could destroy him and the Queen. Do you know who captured your niece?" "No, sir, but I have some ideas." "Did you know that your niece has escaped?" "Yes, sir. An officer told me while I was in prison."
The man stood there silent for a moment. He then hit a silver bell and the officer entered.
"Tell Mr. Rochefort to come here immediately,"
the man said.
"Yes, Cardinal,"
the policeman said while bowing.
"Cardinal?"
Bonacieux thought with a sad heart.
"Now I am in big trouble."
A moment later the door opened and a tall, dark man with a large scar on his cheek came in.
"That's him!"
Bonacieux cried excitedly.
"That man carried away my niece."
The cardinal hit his bell again. The officer came back in.
"Take Mr. Bonacieux back outside,"
said Richelieu.
"and let him wait until I send for him."
Bonacieux was led out of the room. The tall, dark stranger stepped closer to the cardinal and said excitedly,
"They have seen each other." "Who?" "The Duke of Buckingham has been to see the Queen." "Where did they meet?" "At the palace." "How do you know?" "Our good friend Madame Lannoy told me." "Why didn't she let me know sooner?" "The Queen has kept her busy in the palace all the time." "Tell me everything that happened." "Madame Lannoy says that late at night, at about 12, the Queen was in her bedroom, and one of her servants brought her a handkerchief from Madame Bonacieux. The Queen became very pale and said excitedly, 'Wait here for me, ladies. I will return soon.' She was gone about 15 minutes, and then she returned, picked up a small wooden box from the room, and left again." When she came back again, she did not have the box with her. Does Madame Lannoy know what was in the box?
Asked Richelieu.
Yes. Inside was a sash covered with 12 diamonds, which the king gave to the queen on her birthday,
replied Rochefort.
And the queen gave the earrings to Buckingham? Madame Lannoy is sure she must have.
Richelieu thought about this for a moment and then hit his bell a third time. He instructed the officer to bring Bonacieux back in. Rochefort left the room.
You have lied to me,
the cardinal said seriously.
No, sir,
cried Bonacieux, looking shocked.
I have told you everything I know. Your niece escaped and went to meet the Duke of Buckingham. Oh, yes, certainly the great cardinal is right,
Bonacieux cried.
But I was too stupid to know the truth. You are truly the great cardinal, who knows everything that happens in France.
The cardinal's lips smiled a strange smile. He stood up and reached out his hand calmly to Bonacieux.
I was wrong about you, my friend Bonacieux,
he said simply.
I see now that you are a good man. It is an honor to touch the hand of such a great man,
cried Bonacieux.
The great man has even called me his friend. Yes, you are my friend indeed,
the cardinal said.
And since you were hurt and arrested wrongly, I would be happy if you will accept this bag of gold. Great cardinal, I will leave here very honored. Goodbye, then, Mr. Bonacieux. I hope that we will meet again. I am your willing servant, Cardinal. Goodbye for now, Mr. Bonacieux.
Bonacieux bowed deeply and walked out backwards, facing Richelieu and yelling,
Long life to the Cardinal!
A half an hour passed, and then Rochefort returned.
We are too late,
he said.
The Duke of Buckingham has already left France. He must have returned to London. He must be found,
said the cardinal.
Send this letter to England at once.
He sat down and quickly wrote a note.
Milady, go to the next party that the Duke of Buckingham attends. He will wear a sash with 12 diamonds. Get close to the Duke and cut 2 of the diamonds off his sash. Write to me as soon as you have gotten these diamonds.
Chapter 9. Making the Trap. A week later, the cardinal received a letter. I have the diamonds, but I do not have enough money to leave London. Send me 500 gold pieces. Once I receive the money, I shall immediately come to Paris. My Lady. The cardinal sent my lady the money and then went at once to see the king. He talked for a while about some money affairs and then, a little carefully, said,
My king, perhaps the queen would be pleased if you had a party in her honor. You know how much she enjoys dancing. A dancing party?
Said the king, quite surprised at the cardinal's suggestion.
But I hate dancing. Then, my king, I believe the queen will be even more pleased if you arrange one especially for her. A party will give her an opportunity to wear that beautiful diamond sash which you gave her for her birthday. Perhaps it is a good idea,
said the king.
When should we have this party?
The cardinal thought silently for a moment and said,
The 3rd of October, I think, my king, would be an excellent day. Very well,
said the king.
I will go and see the queen at once.
The queen was sitting alone in her room, and the king told her about the plan for the party. What a wonderful idea, my king, she began. I do truly love dancing.
During the evening of this party,
he said,
I wish you to wear the diamond sash I gave you on your birthday.
The queen became pale and looked at her husband with great fear in her eyes. The king saw this, but did not understand why. "When is the party?" asked the queen.
"Soon, my love. I will ask Cardinal Richelieu."
"Oh, it was the cardinal, then, who wanted me to wear my diamond sash to the party?"
"Yes, the cardinal had suggested it."
The king then left the room. She fell onto her bed, put her head down on her pillow, and began to cry. What was she going to do? "May I help you, my queen?" said a soft voice. The queen turned around and saw Constance Bonacieux standing behind her, who had heard everything that the king had said. "Do not be afraid, madam," Constance said. "I think I can help you in your trouble." "Tell me truly," said the queen, reaching out her hand. "Can I trust you to help me?" "Yes, madam," the young woman said as she fell down to her knees. "I am prepared to die for my queen. We must get back the diamond sash. My queen gave it to the Duke of Buckingham. Did you not? We must send someone to see the Duke. I will find someone to go. Write a letter to the Duke, and I promise that it will be delivered. I will give your letter to my uncle. He often travels on business, and no one would think that he would be carrying a letter of his queen. In fact, I can put the letter in his things, and he will not even know that he is carrying it." "I will trust you to help me, then," said the queen. She ran over to a little table on which there were pens and paper. She wrote a note quickly and then closed the letter. "You will need money for this trip also," she said, pulling at a ring on her finger. "Take this ring. I believe it is worth a lot of money. Sell it and have your uncle go immediately. I will have it done within an hour." Constance left the palace and within 10 minutes was at her uncle's house. "Uncle, I need your help," Constance said.
"Did you know,"
he cried,
"that I have just spent 2 days and nights in prison?"
"Yes, uncle. A short time like that passes quickly," she said without caring. "I need you to do something important for me. Do not worry, you will be paid well for it." Bonacieux's eyes became bright with excitement.
"How much?"
he asked. "I don't know exactly. 1,000 gold pieces, perhaps. Now, listen to me carefully, uncle. This is what you must do. You must leave Paris at once. I will give you an important paper that you must not lose, and which you will deliver to a man."
"Where do I need to go?"
"London."
"London? You are joking with me. I have no business in London."
"But now you do have business there. The person who wants you to go is a very famous person."
"I see,"
cried Bonacieux.
"More of your crazy plans. The cardinal has told me about all your wild ideas and troublemaking."
"The cardinal?" Constance said in shock, staring hard at her uncle. "Have you gone to see the cardinal?"
"Yes, he sent for me,"
replied her uncle proudly.
"He called me his friend."
"Are you working for the cardinal now?" whispered Constance.
"Yes, and I am very well paid for it,"
replied Bonacieux, pulling out the bag of gold that the cardinal gave him and showing it to his niece. Constance became very worried about having told her uncle so much, so she tried to hide her thoughts. "Perhaps you are right, uncle," she said. "It is better to work for the great cardinal than for the queen. Forget my crazy idea."
"Aren't you going to tell me what I need to do in London?"
replied her uncle, wanting to hear some interesting news. "Oh, it was really nothing important," said Constance. "It was just about buying some things that only interest women." The more Constance tried to stop talking, the more important her uncle thought her secret was. He decided to go quickly to tell the cardinal that the Queen was looking for somebody to take a letter to London. He said goodbye to Constance and ran off as fast as his small legs would move him. "What shall I do now?" cried Constance. A moment later, as there came a knock on the ceiling, and Constance jumped up in fear. "Who is that?" she yelled up. A voice came through the ceiling. It said,
"Madame Bonacieux, please open the door in the street for me, and I will come down and see you."
Constance thought about the voice for a moment, and a look of hope came to her eyes. It was the voice of d'Artagnan. Chapter 10. Making a Plan.
"Madame Bonacieux,"
said d'Artagnan, coming in through the door which Constance opened,
"I must say that your uncle is a bad man of low honor."
"Did you hear our conversation?" asked Constance.
"Yes, every word."
"But how?"
"By a secret method,"
he answered.
"but that is not important."
"And what did you learn by what we said?"
"That the Queen needs a clever, brave, loyal man to take a letter to London for her. You may decide if I am clever, madam, but I can promise that I am brave and loyal to both the Queen and to you."
"If you guessed all of this from our conversation, then you are indeed a clever man," said Constance, worried. "But I fear my uncle has also guessed the same. He must have gone to tell Cardinal Richelieu of the Queen's plan. I trust you, d'Artagnan. Let me tell you the whole story." Constance then told d'Artagnan the terrible story of the Queen's diamond sash. When she finished, d'Artagnan stood up tall and said,
"If I am captured while trying to deliver the letter,"
he said,
"I will die before I speak one word of what you have told me. I must go to London at once."
"Then take this," said Constance, holding out the Queen's ring. "It was the Queen's, and you can sell it for money to travel to England." She opened a box and took out the bag of gold that her uncle had shown her just a half-hour before. "You should take this money also," she said.
"The Cardinal's gold?"
said d'Artagnan, laughing.
"It will be funny to save the Queen using the Cardinal's money."
"Quiet!" interrupted Constance, moving to the window. "I hear someone talking in the street. It is my uncle's voice."
"Quickly!"
d'Artagnan cried, grasping her hand.
"He must not see us."
They quickly moved to the back door, locked it, and walked up the stairs as silent as shadows. When they were safe in d'Artagnan's room, they went over to the window and looked out through a small space in the curtains. They could see her uncle talking with a tall man wearing a long cloak. A moment later, the tall man turned around, and they could see his face. D'Artagnan quickly jumped to his feet, pulled out his sword, and ran towards the door. The man in the cloak was the man of Meung. "What are you doing?" cried Constance.
"I have promised to kill that man,"
answered d'Artagnan. "D'Artagnan, wait! Your life now belongs to the Queen," she whispered with great strength in her voice. "In the Queen's name, I order you not to put yourself into any danger. Listen, they are talking about me." D'Artagnan put back his sword and slowly moved back to the window. Bonacieux had opened his door and went inside. He returned a moment later and told the man wearing the cloak that his niece had left.
"Do you think,"
said the man,
"that your niece knew your reason for going out?" "I tricked her,"
said Bonacieux happily.
"She could not have known. Is the young musketeer at home?" "No, I have not heard any sound coming from his room in many days." "Let's go into your house. Nobody can see us there."
"Oh, no," said Constance. We will not be able to hear them any more."
"Yes, we will, madam,"
D'Artagnan said.
"We will be able to hear them quite well."
He raised a piece of wood floor in the center of the room, sat down on his knees, and whispered to Constance to join him. When she sat down, she could hear voices from her uncle's house below.
"So, you believe that your niece has gone back to the palace without speaking to anyone but you?"
said the stranger.
"I am quite sure of it. It is important that she has not spoken to anyone, you understand? Then the news I told you is useful." "Yes, quite valuable, my friend Mr. Bonacieux. The cardinal is very pleased with you. Now, tell me, did your niece say any names?" "No, she only said that she needed me to go to London to help a very famous person." "You were foolish not to pretend that you were willing to help her. If you had, then, we would now have the letter, which might tell us some very important information. There is still time,"
said Bonacieux.
"I will go find my niece and tell her that I have thought more about the matter and am willing to help. As soon as she gives me the letter, I will bring it to the cardinal." "Good. Go quickly. I will go prepare all our soldiers so that they can guard the roads going to the coast. It is possible that your niece has already found someone to take the letter to England."
The stranger then left. "My uncle is now one of our enemies," whispered Constance angrily. A terrible scream came from below. Mr. Bonacieux had discovered that his bag of gold was gone and was crying.
"Thieves! Thieves!"
A minute later, he ran out of the house. "We must go at once," said Constance. "Be brave, my friend, and be careful. Remember that you now serve the Queen."
"I serve the Queen and you also,"
said D'Artagnan.
"I will work for her loyally and try to win her praise. But shall I also work loyally for you and win your love?"
Constance stood up and left the room. Her only answer was a beautiful smile on her face. A few minutes later, D'Artagnan also left the room and went to see a gold maker who he knew. He sold the Queen's ring for 2,000 gold pieces. He then went to see Mr. Tréville, and he told him everything.
"I hope,"
D'Artagnan finished saying,
"that you can give me time away from musketeer service so that I may go to London immediately." "Of course, you may go,"
Mr. Tréville began.
"but if you go alone, you will be killed before you reach the coast. For this adventure, 4 good friends must go together so that one may arrive safely. Aramis, Athos, and Porthos shall join you, and you should also take your servants if they know how to use swords and guns."
The young musketeer's face filled with excitement.
"Thank you, sir,"
he cried. D'Artagnan went quickly to Athos' house, where he found his 3 friends talking together.
"Friends,"
said D'Artagnan.
"we must go to London." "London?"
cried Porthos.
"What must we do there?" "I cannot tell you, gentlemen, but you must trust me. Mr. Tréville has let us go, and we serve the Queen." "To get to London,"
Porthos said unhappily,
"we will need money, and I have none."
D'Artagnan threw 2 bags of gold on the table.
"I have money, friends,"
he said.
"There is far more in that bag than we shall need. We will all share it. But I fear that we will not all arrive in London. It is very likely that some of us will be killed on the way. The cardinal will use all his power to stop us from reaching the coast. I must tell you now that this is going to be an extremely dangerous journey." "Could we possibly want anything more than to fight the cardinal?"
said Athos.
"D'Artagnan, I will follow you." "I shall also,"
said Aramis.
You are my friend,
said Porthos.
I will join. When must we go?
Asked Athos.
At once,
answered D'Artagnan.
Our plan is simple. We will take our servants, for they are all good, strong men, and will help us in a fight. I will carry the Queen's letter here in my pocket. If I am killed, one of you must take the letter and go on. If he is killed also, then another man must carry it, and so on. If only one of us arrives in London, it will be enough to help the Queen. Friends, is it agreed? It is agreed,
shouted the Three Musketeers. Chapter 11. Rush to the Coast. That same night 8 men left Paris in the middle of the night. Athos, Porthos, Aramis, D'Artagnan, and their 4 servants. Each man carried a sword, knives, and they even had a few handguns. They traveled easily through the night, and did not have any trouble until they reached Chantilly in the early morning. They were hungry for breakfast, and went to an inn. They entered the eating hall and had a large breakfast. When they finished eating, the men stood up.
Wait, my friends,
a stranger yelled as they stood up.
Before you leave, join me in a drink to the great Cardinal Richelieu. Certainly,
Porthos replied.
If you will also drink to the King's health with me.
The stranger jumped to his feet and stared at Porthos.
I do not know any king but the great Cardinal,
he cried.
Then you must either be drunk or a fool,
Porthos replied. The stranger reached for his sword.
You cannot stop this fight now,
Athos said to Porthos.
We will leave your servant and horse here. Quickly, kill this man and then follow after us.
The 3 men went outside and jumped on their horses. They heard the sound of steel hitting against steel through a window of the inn. They then rode fast along the road. Many miles ahead, the road became narrow between 2 high hills. In front of them, they saw about 10 men fixing the road. As they reached the men, Aramis stopped and asked one of the men where they were. Suddenly, one man yelled loudly, and all the men ran and jumped into a large hole on one side of the road, from which each man lifted a hidden gun.
It's a surprise attack,
D'Artagnan shouted.
Ride fast.
As the men rode down the road, bullets flew all around them. One bullet came so close that it shot D'Artagnan's hat off his head. Then he heard Aramis cry out loudly. A bullet had gone into his arm, but he grasped his horse hard and kept moving as fast as the others. A mile later they all stopped and did all they could to stop the blood flowing from Aramis' wound. They then rode on as fast as they could for 3 more hours. By this time, Aramis' face had become very pale. They found an inn and left Aramis there with his servant. Athos, D'Artagnan, and their 2 servants rode on, not reaching another town until after midnight, and slept in an inn. The inn owner only had 2 rooms left, and each was at opposite sides of the inn. Athos and D'Artagnan knew that it would be safer if they stayed close together, so they decided to sleep in the common hall. D'Artagnan's servant, Planchet, slept next to the door to guard them through the night. Athos' servant, Grimaud, slept outside near the horses, with orders to have them ready at 5 in the morning. Just before 5, they heard a terrible scream and the sounds of fighting near the horses. They ran outside and found Grimaud lying almost dead on the ground. He had been beaten with sticks. The horses were all gone. Athos and D'Artagnan now were certain that the cardinal had planned against them. 2 fresh and strong horses were standing ready by the door of the inn. Their owners had slept in the inn that night and were paying their bill. Athos went inside to pay their bill also, while D'Artagnan and Planchet waited outside. The inn owner looked at the coins that Athos gave him and then cried out that they were false and he would have Athos arrested.
"You lie,"
said Athos, stepping towards him with anger in his eyes. At that moment, 4 men, carrying guns and swords, entered through a side door and attacked Athos.
"D'Artagnan!"
he yelled loudly.
"I am attacked! Run quickly!"
He then fired 2 gunshots. D'Artagnan and Planchet knew they had no time to lose. They jumped onto the 2 horses by the door and rode off at top speed. After a short while, D'Artagnan slowed down his horse.
"Could you see inside? What happened to Athos?"
D'Artagnan asked.
"Mr. D'Artagnan,"
said Planchet,
"I saw a man fall from each of his 2 gunshots, and when we rode off, I could see that he was using his sword to fight the other 2. Brave and strong Athos,"
said D'Artagnan quietly to himself.
"It was hard for me to leave him there, but we must reach our goal. Now, let us ride."
The 2 men were now close to the coast. They rode fast on the last part of their journey to the coast. When they were only 300 steps from the doors of the port, D'Artagnan's horse fell down and was too tired to stand up again. Planchet's horse was tired also, and would not leave the other horse. They got off the horses and ran towards the port. In front of them, they saw a rich gentleman and his servant talking to a ship captain. D'Artagnan listened to their conversation.
"I need to go to England immediately. Can you take me?" "I could take you easily, sir,"
replied the ship captain.
"But this morning Cardinal Richelieu made the order that no people could cross without a letter from the cardinal." "I have that letter,"
said the gentleman, pulling out a piece of paper from his pocket.
"Here it is." "You must first have it examined by the port official,"
said the captain.
"And then I will be happy to take you." "Very well,"
said the gentleman.
"I will be back soon. Please, prepare your ship."
The gentleman and his servant started walking to see the port official. D'Artagnan and Planchet followed them closely. Once outside the gates to the port, D'Artagnan ran in front of the gentleman and turned around.
"Sir,"
D'Artagnan said coolly,
"I need that letter you have in your pocket, and I am going to take it from you." "Are you crazy?"
asked the man.
"Let me pass at once." "You will not pass." "Foolish young man, I will have to shoot out your brains. Servant, give me my pistol." "Planchet,"
yelled D'Artagnan.
"You stop the servant. I'll get the master."
With a quick movement, Planchet threw the servant down to the ground and had a knife at his neck. The gentleman pulled out his sword and jumped at D'Artagnan, only to learn that this man from Gascony was much better with a sword than he was. Within a minute, D'Artagnan had hit the sword out of his hand. D'Artagnan hit the gentleman in the head with the handle of his sword, and the man fell down like a stone. D'Artagnan took the cardinal's letter from his pocket. The name on the letter was the Comte de Ward. Planchet and D'Artagnan then pulled the 2 men into the forest and tied them to a tree.
"And now,"
D'Artagnan said, fixing his hair,
"let's go and see the port official."
He introduced himself as the Comte de Ward to the port official.
"Do you have a letter from the cardinal?"
the port official asked.
"Yes, here it is." "Very good,"
said the port official.
"We need these letters now because the cardinal is trying to stop someone from crossing to England." "Yes,"
answered D'Artagnan.
"It is a man called D'Artagnan. He must be stopped at all costs." "Do you know him? What does he look like?"
the port official asked excitedly.
Yes, I could describe him well,
said D'Artagnan, and gave the port official a description of the real Comte de Wardes.
Is he with anyone?
asked the port official.
He is probably with his servant. We will look for them.
An hour later, D'Artagnan and Planchet were already on a ship to England. At 10 o'clock the next morning, the ship arrived in the harbor of Dover. Just a few hours after that, D'Artagnan and Planchet rode into the streets of London. Chapter 12. London. D'Artagnan had never been to London before. In fact, he only spoke a little bit of English. To find his way around, he simply wrote the name Buckingham down on a piece of paper. Every one he showed the paper to pointed him the way to the Duke's grand house. When D'Artagnan arrived, he told the Buckingham servant that he had come all the way from Paris on a matter of life and death, and that he needed to see the Duke immediately.
And who are you?
The servant asked.
Just tell the Duke that I am the young man who wanted to fight with him in Paris,
D'Artagnan replied. The servant stared at D'Artagnan in surprise, but went to find the Duke anyway. Just a few minutes later, Buckingham had come to greet D'Artagnan.
Is everything all right with the Queen?
He asked, showing great worry in his voice.
I think she is having some kind of trouble, sir,
answered D'Artagnan.
I have brought you this letter from her.
Buckingham reached for the letter with nervous fingers and opened it with fear on his face. He became pale white as he read. He then ordered his servant to get the wooden box that the Queen had given him. He then opened it and pulled out the blue sash covered with diamonds.
The Queen gave this to me, but now the Queen needs them back again,
he said, looking sad.
And so they must be brought to her at once.
His sad eyes stared carefully at the beautiful sash. Suddenly he cried out,
All is lost.
He then became even paler.
There should be 12 diamonds. Now there are only 10. 2 diamonds are missing. Can they just be lost, or do you think they have been stolen? Certainly, stolen, I am sure,
the Duke said angrily.
Look, the sash has been cut. The Cardinal must have done this somehow. Let me think. I have only worn these diamonds one time. It was at a party in the palace about 8 days ago. Who was there that could have done this? Yes, I remember. It must have been the Countess of Winter. Who is the Countess of Winter?
D'Artagnan asked.
She is a woman hiding many secrets, and I believe that she works for the Cardinal. She was born in France, but she married a powerful British man about 5 years ago. 2 years ago, he died, and I remember at that time many people said that she had killed her own husband. What does the Countess of Winter look like?
Asked D'Artagnan. The Duke described her beautiful face, lovely skin, and terrible heart. D'Artagnan thought for a minute and remembered the woman's face he had seen in the carriage in Meung.
Milady,
he whispered quietly to himself, and then said aloud,
Does the Cardinal have helpers and spies everywhere? Yes, many,
replied Buckingham.
He is a powerful and terrible man to have as an enemy. But perhaps we can beat him. When is the Queen's party going to happen? Next Monday. Monday? We still have 5 days. Perhaps we still have enough time. Patrick,
cried the Duke loudly. The servant entered the room.
Patrick, go get my jeweler and my secretary, ordered Buckingham.
The secretary arrived quickly. Buckingham was already sitting at his table, writing orders.
"Mr. Jackson,"
the Duke began, handing the man some papers.
"go immediately to see the Lord Chancellor and explain to him that all these orders must be done at once."
The secretary bowed deeply and left.
"I have ordered that no ships may leave England without my written permission,"
Buckingham said, turning to d'Artagnan.
"If the diamonds have not yet left for Paris, they will not get there until after you."
A minute later, the jeweler arrived.
"Mr. O'Reilly,"
began the Duke,
"look at the diamonds on this sash, and tell me how long it will take to make 2 more exactly the same as them." "I can do it in 8 days, my lord." "I will pay you 3,000 gold pieces if you can make them in 3 days." "My lord, it will be done. I will begin at once."
The jeweler left quickly to begin working.
"There is only one more thing left to do,"
said Buckingham, turning to look at d'Artagnan.
"Brave sir, how can I thank you? What do you desire?" "A bed, my lord,"
d'Artagnan replied quickly. Buckingham laughed and ordered his servant to prepare him a room next to his own. D'Artagnan slept for many hours. 2 days later, the jeweler returned with the diamond earrings. They were copied so perfectly that neither Buckingham nor d'Artagnan could see any difference between the new diamonds and the old ones.
"Here,"
he said to d'Artagnan,
"are the diamonds you came to get. Please tell the Queen that I have kept the wooden box, since it is the only thing of hers that she has left to me. And now, please tell me how I may repay you. I am the loyal servant of the Queen. I need no pay." "Very well spoken,"
Buckingham said.
"Now, here is what you must do. I have prepared a ship for you. It will take you directly to the town of St. Valery on the French coast. Go to the town's only inn and ask to see the inn owner. Tell him the secret word, 'Forward,' and he will give you a fresh horse and directions to the next town and inn. When you reach the next inn, say the secret word again, and he will give you a fresh horse and more directions, and so on. On your journey to Paris, you will stop at 4 inns. Please tell each inn owner your address in Paris, and they will have the horses sent there. Please accept one of these horses as my gift of thanks, and to ask your 3 friends to take the others. That is, if your friends did not lose their lives helping the Queen. I pray that they have not. Thank you for your help, my lord,"
said d'Artagnan with a bow.
"Thank you, young man. It is a pleasure to meet a man with your courage."
D'Artagnan shook hands with the Duke, bowed, and left the house. He made his way to the river quickly. He found the ship that the Duke had prepared. He gave his letter of introduction to the captain, and they left for France immediately. Many ships were stopped in the port, waiting for the Duke's permission to leave. Passing by one ship, d'Artagnan saw the woman from the carriage in Meung, the woman called My Lady, also known as the Countess of Winter. She was walking anxiously up and down the floor of her ship. D'Artagnan tried to hide his face, but he had a feeling that she saw him too. My Lady did see him. She pretended not to notice him. But if d'Artagnan had seen the deep hatred in her eyes when she saw him, he would have known that he had a cruel and terrible enemy. He arrived in France and found the first inn. 12 hours later, he had already arrived in Paris. At 9 o'clock in the morning, he reached the Musketeers' camp. Mr. Treville told him that Athos, Porthos, and Aramis had all come back to Paris safely. D'Artagnan was more than happy to hear the news. Chapter 13. The Queen's Party. D'Artagnan arrived back on Sunday. The next day was the party. In addition to dancing, there was also going to be a performance of the king's favorite costume play, and the king and queen were going to be actors. The king looked tired and worried when he arrived at the party. The queen arrived about half an hour later and looked even more worried than the king. The queen saw Cardinal Richelieu dressed in the costume of a Spanish soldier. He was watching the queen carefully with his sharp eyes. When he saw that the queen was not wearing her diamond sash, a horrible smile appeared on his lips.
"I must tell the king this at once,"
he whispered to himself and walked over to see him. The queen was walking around and talking with the guests. Suddenly the king, followed closely by the cardinal, rushed up to her.
"Madam, why aren't you wearing the diamond sash I gave you?"
he asked sharply. "I was worried that I might lose them at such a large party," the queen replied, a quite nervous voice.
"I am sure you will not, madam. What is the point of me giving you beautiful things if you are afraid to wear them?"
"I will have my servants go get them," the queen replied.
"Do so at once, madam,"
the king said coldly,
"for the costume play will begin very soon."
Both the king and the queen then went to their rooms to change for the play. The king came back first. He was dressed in the costume of a hunter. The cardinal handed the king a small box. The king opened it and saw 2 diamonds inside.
"What does this mean?"
the king asked in anger.
"Nothing, sire,"
the cardinal replied softly.
"Only if the queen is wearing her diamonds, count them. If you only find 10, ask the queen who could have stolen the 2 diamonds that are here."
The king stared at the cardinal and was about to question him, but before he could say anything, the whole hall became quiet, and all the guests spoke in whispers of great respect. The queen had entered the hall, dressed in the costume of a huntress. She was wearing the sash, covered with diamonds, over her shoulders. The king looked at her with great joy, and the cardinal stared at her with great anger, but they were both too far away to clearly count the diamonds. At that moment the costume play began, and lasted an hour. Just as the play ended, the king, followed by the cardinal, walked up to the queen.
"Madam, thank you for wearing your diamond sash,"
he said.
"But I believe 2 of them are missing, and I have brought them back to you."
He opened his hand and held out the 2 diamonds the cardinal had given him. The queen smiled and pretended to look happy and surprised. "My king is giving me 2 more diamonds," she said. "How wonderful! Now I shall have 14. The cardinal walked up next to the queen, while the king's eyes counted the diamonds on the sash. All 12 diamonds were still there. The king turned angrily to Cardinal Richelieu.
"What do you mean by this?"
he asked loudly. The cardinal's eyes became hot and angry, but he smiled with his lips.
"It means, sire,"
replied Richelieu,
"that I wish to give the queen 2 more diamonds, since this party is in her honor. Because I would not dare give them to her myself, I needed to use this method to persuade her to accept them."
The queen held out her hand to the cardinal and smiled. "Thank you, Cardinal Richelieu. I am sure these 2 diamonds must have cost you as much as all the others cost the king." Only one other person in the hall understood the queen's strange words and the angry look on the cardinal's face. It was D'Artagnan, who was standing back among the busy crowd, watching the conversation. A few minutes later, the queen left the hall. D'Artagnan was going to leave also, when he felt someone touch his shoulder. It was Constance. His heart jumped with excitement when she asked him to follow her. She led him into a small room and then left. The walls of the room were covered with cloth. D'Artagnan waited there for a few minutes quietly. Suddenly, he saw part of one of the walls open up like a door. He jumped up with shock. A hand and an arm came out through the small hole. The hand and arm were so white and lovely that D'Artagnan immediately knew that it was the Queen herself. He fell down on one knee, took the hand carefully in his, and kissed it lightly. The hand then left just as quietly as it had come. Again, D'Artagnan was alone in the room. He looked down in his hand and saw that the Queen had left a beautiful ring in it. The Queen always thanked those loyal to her. D'Artagnan put the beautiful ring on his finger and sat there staring at it. A minute later, Constance Bonacieux returned.
"At last, it is you,"
D'Artagnan said excitedly. "Quiet," Constance whispered, putting up a finger to his lips. "Be silent and leave the way you came."
"But when will I see you again?"
"There will be a note at your house which will tell you everything. Now go, quickly." Before he could say anything else, she opened the door and pushed him out. He did not argue and obeyed her like a small child, which proved that D'Artagnan was really in love. Chapter 14. Capture. D'Artagnan did not reach home again until after 3 in the morning. Inside, on the table in his room, he found a letter from Constance. He opened it excitedly and read, "I must thank you for all your help, from myself and the Queen. Come to the pavilion behind the church this evening at about 10 o'clock. D'Artagnan's young heart filled with excitement. He walked around the room unable to sleep, but eventually he lay down and fell into sweet dreams. Later that morning, D'Artagnan went off to the Musketeers' station to see Mr. Tréville. The captain was in a good mood. He was pleased that the king and queen were so happy at the party, and was even more pleased that the cardinal looked so angry. When he saw D'Artagnan, his happy face changed.
"Sit down, my young friend,"
he said.
"We must talk about serious business. Your actions have saved the Queen and caused the cardinal's plans to fail. You must be very careful now." "Why should I be careful? What do I have to fear?"
D'Artagnan asked with his head high.
"You have much to fear, young man, believe me. The cardinal does not forget his enemies, and you are now one of his most troublesome enemies. I believe that the cardinal will try to hurt you, and he may hurt you in some way that you do not expect." "The terrible devil!"
said D'Artagnan.
"What should I do?" "You must always be careful and see that there are many enemies all around you. You cannot trust anybody, not your friends, your family, or even your love. Do you have a love, D'Artagnan?"
D'Artagnan's face turned red. Tréville nodded his head in understanding.
"Be careful about your love. The cardinal may try to hurt you through a woman,"
he said seriously.
"Be careful, young D'Artagnan. I say it again. You are the enemy of the most powerful man in France."
D'Artagnan left the Musketeers' station and went to see Athos, Porthos, and Aramis. He heard about each of their journeys, fights, and their return to Paris. At 9 o'clock that night, D'Artagnan left for the church and soon arrived in front of the pavilion. It was in the church garden in a quiet spot. D'Artagnan sat against a tree and waited. A few minutes later, the church bells rang 10 times. D'Artagnan did not move. He just watched the pavilion closely. All the pavilion's windows were closed except a small one on the first floor. The church clock hit 10:30. D'Artagnan felt his body become cold, but it was a warm night and he did not know why. He began walking up and down and became more and more worried about the quiet. Finally, 11 o'clock came, and D'Artagnan became very afraid that something terrible had happened to Constance. He decided to look into the pavilion. He climbed in through the window and walked up to the second floor. On the second floor, one of the windows was broken in, and the door was broken also. A table and many chairs were turned over, and D'Artagnan could tell that there had been a violent fight. D'Artagnan climbed back out of the window and ran quickly down to the street. His heart was moving fast, but his mind was clear. He saw things that he had not seen while coming to the church. The ground was covered with the footsteps of horses, and the wheels of a carriage had made small holes in the soft ground. A few minutes later, he was riding his horse fast towards Paris. It was not until 6 in the morning that D'Artagnan arrived back at his house. Mr. Bonacieux was waiting at his door.
"Hello, young man,"
he began.
"It seems that you have a very happy night. It is 6 in the morning, and you are just coming home, eh? What fun did you have last night? Just look at your shoes."
D'Artagnan looked down and saw that his boots were all covered with mud. He noticed that Bonacieux's shoes were also muddy. He suddenly realized that Bonacieux must have found a way to read the note that his niece had sent to D'Artagnan and had told the cardinal. D'Artagnan wanted to pull his sword out right then and kill him, but he pretended to be happy and smiled.
"Last night I went to a party with many friends. A very merry one indeed,"
he said.
"I'll go and make Planchet clean my shoes. When he is finished, I will, if you wish, send him down to clean your shoes also."
D'Artagnan thought that Bonacieux might know where his niece was, and that he might be able to make him tell. He decided to first go and talk with his 3 friends and plan a way to rescue Constance. Chapter 15. The Rescue Plan. D'Artagnan and his friends sat discussing what they should do.
"We should have guessed that the cardinal would do something like this,"
Athos said seriously. The others all agreed with him.
"We must rescue her,"
D'Artagnan cried wildly.
"We must act now. We cannot wait."
Athos placed a hand on D'Artagnan's shoulder.
"We will save her,"
he said quietly.
"But we must think clearly first. Our enemy is a very powerful man in France. We will need the help of powerful people." "The Queen will help,"
said Aramis suddenly.
"We must go to tell the Queen what has happened at once." "Yes,"
cried D'Artagnan, his eyes filling with the light of hope.
"But how can we get a message to her? I am familiar with a lady who is close to the Queen,"
said Aramis, looking quite embarrassed. D'Artagnan suddenly remembered his first meeting with Aramis and the lady's handkerchief that he was standing on. He also remembered that Constance had spoken once with a woman at a window of Aramis' house.
"Aramis's idea is good,"
said Athos.
"We should act at once. I hear that the King and Queen have been close recently. Perhaps she can persuade him to help us. Now, Aramis, tell us, how shall we send our message to the Queen, and how long will it take to reach her?"
Aramis looked over at the clock on the wall.
"Our message will be given to the Queen by mouth,"
he said,
"and will reach her ear within the hour."
D'Artagnan and his friends waited. Aramis promised D'Artagnan that the Queen would definitely help save Constance. But for 3 days there was no new news. During those 3 days and nights, D'Artagnan was very worried and could not think about anything except Constance. He practiced his sword skills and sat in his room, waiting to hear some news. Finally, on the evening of the third day, Aramis arrived with news.
"Madame Bonacieux is safe and well,"
he said.
"Tell me, where is she?"
cried d'Artagnan.
"She was put into the prison of Mantes,"
Aramis answered.
"But the king has written an order which says that she is to be taken to a convent." "Which convent?"
d'Artagnan asked, with great excitement in his voice.
"I still don't know. The queen told me that the name must be kept secret until Constance is safe there. Once she is safe, we will be told, and we can then go there and take Madame Bonacieux away to some safe place." "How long until she is there?"
asked d'Artagnan.
"Not long,"
said Aramis, placing a hand on d'Artagnan's arm.
"Do not worry, my friend."
The Musketeers waited 5 more days before news arrived. Aramis came over to d'Artagnan's room, holding a few pieces of paper in his hand.
"Here is a letter from my cousin,"
he said.
"Inside is the information that you have been waiting to hear."
D'Artagnan quickly pulled the letter out of Aramis' hand and read, "Dear cousin, you should go to Bethune. My sister has left our old servant in the convent there. Here is a letter from my sister to take the servant out of the convent. Goodbye, my dear cousin. Send news as soon as you are able. Marie Michon." The other piece of paper was an order. It said, October 12th, 1626. The convent of Bethune will let the person holding this letter take the girl who recently entered the convent. Anne.
"Let us quickly go meet Athos and tell him what has happened,"
said d'Artagnan.
"I will tell Planchet to go find Porthos and tell him to come to join us as soon as he can."
Just a few minutes later, Planchet had gone, and the young Musketeers had left to find Athos. A few more minutes passed, and the door to d'Artagnan's room opened slowly and quietly. Mr. Bonacieux looked in without making a sound. When he saw that the room was empty, he came in and looked around. He saw the letter on the table and read it with great excitement. He was about to put it in his pocket, but then changed his mind.
"I should not take it,"
he said to himself,
"or they might know that it was me who took it. However, the cardinal will certainly be interested to learn of its contents. He will be very happy with me indeed."
Bonacieux then turned around and ran quickly down the stairs.
"Mr. Bonacieux, my friend,"
said the cardinal,
"you are a good man. Please, accept this bag of gold as thanks."
Bonacieux accepted the bag with large eyes, said his thanks, and bowed deeply. He then left the room. The cardinal rang the bell sitting on his writing table. A moment later an officer entered.
"Bring Rochefort and Milady here immediately,"
the cardinal ordered. Just a minute later, the door opened, and the scarred Rochefort came in with the lovely Milady.
"Milady and Rochefort,"
began the cardinal,
"I need you both to leave Paris immediately on a mission of great importance. You both should remember a young servant girl of the Queen named Constance Bonacieux. I had her put in the prison in Mantes, but now this young lady has been freed and moved by the Queen to a convent in Bethune. A young musketeer, her lover, is preparing to go to Bethune and to move Madame Bonacieux to some secret place." "Aha!"
Rochefort said with fire in his eyes.
"I know which young man you mean."
"I know also," cried my lady. Her eyes were angry as well. "You mean the musketeer d'Artagnan, who caused me to fail you in the affair of the diamond earrings."
"Listen to the plan,"
said the cardinal.
"You, milady, We'll go to Bethune by carriage. Rochefort will be your guard. Rochefort must not enter the convent, because Madame Bonacieux knows him. Milady, you will tell her that the Queen and her lover, D'Artagnan, sent you to take her to a place of safety. She has never seen you, and you should be able to trick her easily. I will write you a letter of order, but only use it if you truly need it."
The cardinal sat down at his table and wrote a short letter. "When we have the girl, what should we do then?" my lady asked, as he finished writing. "Where should we take her?" The cardinal thought for a moment and then wrote one word on the bottom of the letter.
"It is written here,"
he said. The cardinal then wrote another letter and handed it to my lady.
"Make her sign this letter. Let her know that she will stay guarded until she signs it. This letter will be very useful to me. Milady, use all your skills to persuade her to sign the letter."
My lady smiled terribly. "Cardinal," she said with eyes hard as stone, "I promise that I will not fail you again." Chapter 16. The Race to the Convent. D'Artagnan, the Musketeers, and their 4 servants prepared all night and left Paris at 5 the next morning. Their horses were from the Duke of Buckingham and were fast and strong. By early evening, they had travelled as far as Arras, where they stopped to eat and rest the horses. Just as they came close to the inn, a carriage rode away. D'Artagnan thought that he had seen the carriage before. Just then a man came out of the inn and rode off on his horse. When D'Artagnan saw the man, he jumped back on his horse and yelled,
"You will not escape me now."
Before he could ride away, Athos grasped his arm and asked,
"Where are you going now, D'Artagnan?" "That was the man of Meung,"
D'Artagnan cried.
"I saw his face when the wind blew open his cloak. Quickly, gentlemen, we must follow him." "My dear D'Artagnan,"
said Aramis,
"you must remember that his horse is fresh and ours are tired from a day of travel. We have no chance of following him."
Just then, the inn owner came running outside.
"Mister,"
he yelled after the man of Meung.
"Mister, you dropped a piece of paper." "Friend,"
said D'Artagnan, turning quickly to the owner,
"I will give you a piece of gold for that paper."
The host looked at him with large, happy eyes, and then said with a smile,
Of course. Here it is."
D'Artagnan opened the paper, read the words on it, and suddenly gave a shocked yell.
"It is a death order signed by the cardinal himself,"
he said.
"Friends, look at this."
The Musketeers came close to read the words.
October 13th, 1626. "It is by my permission and for the good of France that the man holding this letter has killed who he has killed. Richelieu."
And then, written at the bottom of the paper, just one word, Armentières.
"That must be his destination,"
said Athos, putting a hand on D'Artagnan's shoulder.
"and he is just on some business of the cardinal's. Come, D'Artagnan, remember our business. Let us eat and rest, and then ride on to Bethune in a few hours."
Athos then walked into the inn, followed by Aramis and Porthos. D'Artagnan waited outside for a moment, looking down the road. He then made a decision, one that he would regret for the rest of his life. He turned around and followed his friend into the inn, and let the man of Meung ride on. In the middle of the night, Constance Bonacieux was awakened in her small room at the convent. "Wake up, my child. You must dress at once," said the head of the convent. "Someone has come from Paris to see you." Constance's eyes filled with excitement, and she sat up quickly. "Is it a young man?" she asked. The woman shook her head slowly. "No, a young lady," she answered. "A very lovely lady," The Countess de la Fère. The excitement left Constance's face. I do not know her. Constance dressed and was then led into a room where a young woman sat at a table covered with food and wine. My lady stood up and raised her hands to Constance. My dear lady, do you not know why I am here? She asked softly. How can I know? I know nothing. Perhaps you know my husband, the musketeer called Athos, said my lady. Yes, said Constance. I have heard his name from d'Artagnan. I have heard all your news, about how you were captured in the pavilion at the church, said my lady, and about how the Queen rescued you from prison. I have also been told, by the handsome d'Artagnan, who truly loves you with all his heart. Did he send you here to say that he will soon come? Constance asked hopefully. My lady shook her head sadly. No, he cannot, she said. Both d'Artagnan and my husband are watched day and night by the cardinal's men. They did not dare to come here and lead the cardinal to you. Because of this, they have sent me here to take you to a safe place. You are here alone? Asked Constance, looking shocked. Yes, my dear lady, and we leave here quickly. Many times while traveling here, I thought that someone was following my carriage. My lady sat down again and looked at Constance's face to see if she believed her. It seemed that Constance believed her. She did not think that a woman could be one of the cardinal's spies. What must I do? Constance asked. You must come with me, replied my lady. My husband has a secret place where we can hide and wait for d'Artagnan. I understand. You are right, cried Constance. I will go and prepare. Suddenly, they heard the sound of horses running on the road outside. My lady ran over to the window and looked out into the night. Oh, my God, said Constance, afraid. Who is that outside? I may have been followed by the cardinal's men, said my lady. Wait there. The horses came closer and stopped outside the convent. My lady looked out and saw 8 men on horses. She recognized one of them as d'Artagnan. It's the cardinal's guards, she cried, turning to Constance. Quickly, we must run. Yes, we must go, said Constance, but she was too afraid to move. They then heard the horses stop under the window. Then came the sound of my lady's carriage, which rode off quickly. Then 4 gunshots were fired. Your carriage has gone, cried Constance. We can still escape safely, cried my lady. We can run across the garden. Hurry! We must go before they come inside. Constance was filled with fear. She walked a few steps and then fell down on her knees. My lady tried to carry her, but was not strong enough. Stand up, woman! We must run! She cried in anger. I can't, Constance said, crying loudly. I am too afraid. I cannot move. Leave me and escape yourself. I will not leave you here, cried my lady. She ran over to the table and poured a glass of wine. She then mixed some poison into the glass that she had hidden in her dress. My lady then gave the glass to Constance and said, Drink this wine quickly. It will give you strength. She put the glass up to Constance's lips and made her drink. This is not how I wished to take revenge, thought my lady, but I now have no other way. She put the glass down on the table and quickly ran out of the room. Constance tried to stand up, took a few steps, and fell back down into a chair, not able to move. There was a loud yell, and a moment later, the door to the room flew open. D'Artagnan and the 3 musketeers rushed into the room. D'Artagnan threw down his sword and pistol and ran over to Constance. Athos, Porthos, and Aramis put their swords and pistols back into their belts and stood watching d'Artagnan. Constance's face was pale, and she looked at d'Artagnan like she was dreaming. "You've come to save me," she said. "She said you wouldn't."
Yes, yes,
d'Artagnan said softly.
we have come and all is well now.
"She said you wouldn't come," repeated Constance weakly.
She? Who do you mean?
Asked d'Artagnan. "Athos' wife. She heard your horses and thought you were the cardinal's guards. She just ran away."
I still don't understand,
said d'Artagnan.
Who is this woman?
"The woman whose carriage was outside at the door,"
What is her name?
cried d'Artagnan. "I can't remember. It is strange. My head hurts. Oh, my God, I cannot see,"
Her hands are as cold as ice.
cried d'Artagnan.
She is sick. Quickly, bring me water.
Aramis ran over to the table to get some water. He stopped when he saw Athos, who was standing near the table and looking sadly at the glass of wine. Athos walked over to Constance. She took a deep breath and opened her eyes.
Dear madam,
he said softly, holding up the glass of poisoned wine.
Whose glass of wine is this?
"It is mine, mister," replied the young woman.
Who poured the wine in this glass?
"She did, the Countess de la Fère." Athos stared at the wine-glass and made a terrible cry. Then he threw it down to the floor and said just one word.
Poison!
"D'Artagnan, I cannot see. Where are you?" cried Constance. "Do not leave me, d'Artagnan. I am dying." D'Artagnan quickly moved over to her side. Her face was pale, and sweat came down her head. Her breath was weak, and she could not speak. Suddenly, Constance lifted her arms and held d'Artagnan's head in her hands. Her eyes opened, and she looked at him for a moment, as if her whole soul had passed into his eyes, and gave one last breath. Chapter 17. The Man in Red. It was a sad night for d'Artagnan and the other musketeers. Eventually, each of them went to their room to try and sleep. Before going to bed, Athos gave orders to the 4 servants to leave at dawn and travel to Armentières, each by a different road. He asked Planchet to follow the road the carriage had gone. Early the next morning, d'Artagnan came to see Athos and asked what was to be done.
We must wait,
replied Athos. A few hours later, the woman of the convent told the musketeers that the funeral of Constance would happen at noon. At noon, the 4 friends went to the convent. The funeral bells were ringing, the church was open, and Constance's body lay there, wearing a white dress. At the church door, d'Artagnan's courage failed him, and he turned around to look for Athos, but Athos had disappeared. Athos had walked to the garden. He was following my lady's foot tracks. He discovered that she had left through a back door that led into the garden and had gotten in her carriage there. Athos went back to the inn and found Planchet there waiting for him. Planchet had followed the tracks of the carriage and seen the inn where the horses had stopped. He knew that my lady had gone to Armentières. There was only one inn in the town. It was called the Post. Planchet went to the inn and learned from the inn owner that a young woman had arrived the night before in a carriage. She was with a man on horseback, but he left her an hour later. The woman had rented a room, sent for the inn owner, and told him that she wanted to stay in the town for a long time. Planchet did not need any other information. He met with the other 3 servants, told them to watch all the doors of the inn, and came to find Athos. Athos thanked Planchet and called for his horse. He rode quickly to the city of Lille, approximately 15 miles away. he returned to Bethune that evening with a tall man. He left him waiting at an inn outside of the town, and then rode to meet his friends at their inn. By now it was late night. Athos bought a fresh horse from the inn owner, then called his friends together and told them that the time had come for their journey. Within a few minutes, all three were ready and waiting outside the inn. Athos came down last and saw that d'Artagnan was already on his horse.
"Wait,"
cried Athos.
"We must wait for one more man."
The three men looked at each other surprised, but Athos did not say anything. Planchet brought Athos his horse, and he jumped lightly up on its back.
"Wait here for me,"
he said.
"I will be back soon."
He returned 10 minutes later, riding next to a tall man wearing a large red cloak. Again the Musketeers looked at each other surprised. Athos still said nothing, however, and the Musketeers, Planchet, and the man in the red cloak left on the road to Armentières. As they came close to Armentières, the sky became dark and it began to rain heavily. They covered their heads with their cloaks and rode on in the rain. As they entered the town, a man stepped out into the middle of the road. He raised an arm, telling the men to stop. Athos recognized his servant, Grimaud.
"Is something wrong?"
he asked.
"Has she left the town? Where is she?"
Grimaud pointed east towards the river Lys.
"She is in a small house in the forest. It is about half a mile from here, in the direction of the river,"
he said. Grimaud led the group into the forest. Many minutes passed. Grimaud again raised his arm, and the men saw a small and lonely house sitting near the river. Close to the house, on the river bank, sat a small boat. One window of the house had a light in it. Then a man climbed down from a tree, who had been hiding in the branches. It was Porthos' servant, Mousqueton.
"She is still in the house,"
he said.
"Bazin is watching the door." "Good,"
Athos whispered quietly.
"You have done well."
He jumped off his horse and gave it to Grimaud. He then walked quietly towards the window. He climbed the wall and stared in the window. He could see a woman sitting in a chair near a fire. From the window he could not see her face, but he knew it was certainly the woman he wanted to find. At this moment, one of the Musketeers' horses made a sound. My lady turned her head and saw Athos' face in the window. She screamed and jumped up. Athos kicked the window open with his knee. The glass broke, and Athos, full of thoughts of revenge, jumped into the room. My lady ran to the door and threw it open. D'Artagnan stood outside the door, wet from the rain and pale in his face. He held a pistol in his hand and looked like the spirit of death. My lady fell back with a scream of fear.
"Put down your pistol, D'Artagnan,"
yelled Athos.
"We must take this woman to a court, not kill her. Come in, gentlemen."
My lady looked up at the men, white and afraid. "What do you want?" she suddenly screamed. Athos stared down at the woman on the floor.
"We plan to judge you according to your crimes."
Chapter 18. The Trial.
"You may speak to defend yourself,"
said Athos.
"Mr. D'Artagnan, you may speak to her first."
D'Artagnan stepped closer to my lady.
"I have little to say,"
he began.
"I believe this woman fed poison to Constance Bonacieux, who died yesterday."
Athos turned to Porthos and Aramis.
"We also believe this,"
they said together.
"Now it is my turn,"
said Athos, who suddenly became strangely pale.
"Gentlemen, I know this woman well. She is my wife."
His three friends could hardly believe him and stared at him in shock. My lady covered her face with her hands.
"I must tell you my secret. My true name is not Athos. Mr. Treville is the only man in Paris who knows my real name,"
said Athos.
"Gentlemen, last night you heard Madame Bonacieux say my name. I am the Comte de la Fère. I married this woman here when she was only 16 years old, and she was as lovely as an angel. She lived with her brother, who was a religious man, in a town where I was the official. They had recently come to the town, and nobody knew where they came from. Still, she was so beautiful, and her brother was so good, that nobody asked them about their past. I fell in love with her when I first saw her, and married her even though my family did not want me to. In our first months together, I quickly discovered that her lovely face hid a terrible heart."
Athos stopped talking for a moment, and a strange smile appeared on his lips.
"One day,"
he continued,
"I saw her changing clothes in the light. She had never let me see her body in the light before, and I learned why. On her shoulder she had a tattoo. It was the mark of death, saying that she was going to be executed. She told me that she had been a thief, and she admitted that she had stolen the money from a church."
He paused again, but the others were too shocked to speak.
"I was a high official, and in my land I had the power of life and death. So I tied her hands and legs and hung her on a tree, and left her there to die. As you can see, my friends, she did not die then, although I believe that she did." "Are you sure that this is the same woman?"
asked Porthos, staring at my lady in shock.
"You can see yourself,"
said Athos, and he pulled the shirt off her beautiful shoulders. On one of her lovely shoulders was the mark of death.
"My God,"
Porthos said, then became quiet again. My lady made a cry of anger and pulled her shoulders back into her shirt. She stared at Athos with eyes full of hate. "I dare you to find the man who gave me the mark," she screamed. "Only he has the right of the law."
"Quiet,"
said a deep voice.
"I will answer to that."
The tall man in the red cloak took a step forward, and then lifted a hand and took off his cloak. My lady looked up at his face, and her eyes filled with fear. "Oh, no, no, no!" she screamed. You are... She could hardly speak from fear. "You are the executioner of Lille." Chapter 19. The Execution. The musketeers all stepped back, and the man wearing the red cloak stood alone in the center of the room. "Please forgive me," cried my lady, falling down on her knees. The man said nothing and waited for silence.
"That woman,"
he began,
"was once a lovely young girl. She was as beautiful as she is now. She joined a convent and became a nun. The head of the convent was a young man, and he fell in love with her. Eventually she persuaded him to marry her and to travel far away together. But they needed money to escape to another part of France. She stole many things from the church, and the man sold them. But then, just before they left, they were arrested. They were taken to prison, and within a week the prison official's son had fallen in love with her. She was punished with 10 years in prison, but he helped her to escape. The head of the convent was also punished with 10 years, and to be marked. At that time, I was the executioner of the city of Lille, as this woman has already said. It was my job to mark the man, and I did, and that man was my only brother. I promised myself that the woman should at least share his punishment because she had stolen and destroyed him. I learned where she was hidden, so I went to find her. I caught her and placed the same mark on her shoulder that I had to give to my brother. When I returned to Lille, I learned that my brother had just escaped from prison, The people of the town thought I had helped him escape, and they put me in prison until he was caught. My brother, of course, did not know this. He had followed this woman. They went together to the town of Berry, and he found a job. They told everyone that this woman was his sister. A short time later, the official of that area fell in love with her and asked to marry her. She left my brother to marry the official and became the Countess de la Fère. My brother's heart was broken, and he could not live in the same area as her. He decided to come back to Lille. When he learned that I was put in prison for him, he came and took my place willingly. I was set free, and my brother was put in prison. A few nights later he killed himself. That is the story of this woman's crime, and why she was given the mark of death. Mr. d'Artagnan,
Athos said seriously,
what punishment do you think should be given to this woman? The punishment of execution,
answered d'Artagnan.
Mr. Aramis and Mr. Porthos,
Athos continued,
you are judges here. What punishment do you believe is fair? The punishment of execution,
answered the Musketeers. My lady screamed and moved forward on her knees towards her judges. She tried to speak, but no sound came out of her mouth. The executioner grasped her arm and pulled her out of the house. The executioner brought her to the boat on the river. He then tied her hands together. She turned to the men and cried out, "You all are murderers! 9 men to kill 1 woman!"
A woman? You are not a woman,
Athos said coldly.
You are a terrible devil escaped from hell, and we are now sending you back.
You do not have the power of life and death. You are not judges, screamed my lady. You cannot kill me.
You are not a judge, and you killed Constance Bonacieux,
said d'Artagnan. My lady yelled in fear and fell down on her knees. The executioner began to prepare the boat. "Oh, God!" she screamed. "Are you going to throw me in the river?"
Executioner, do your job,
said Athos.
Yes, sir, willingly,
answered the executioner.
For I believe that, in the eyes of God, I am doing right.
The boat began to move slowly across the river. The musketeers watched the boat cross to the other side. The sky was red, and the executioner and my lady looked like black shadows. In this time, my lady was able to untie the rope around her hands and feet. When they reached the other side, she jumped away from the boat and began to run. The rain had made the ground wet, and she fell down in the mud. The musketeers on the other side of the river saw the executioner slowly raise his arms. His sword was bright with moonlight. His 2 arms came down with great speed and power, and my lady gave out one last little cry. Chapter 20. The Cardinal's Messenger. When d'Artagnan returned to Paris, he rented some rooms near the house of Athos. One evening, while he sat thinking over a bottle of wine in his bedroom, there was a loud knock at the door. Before d'Artagnan could stand up, the door was pushed open. The man at the door looked around the room and quickly saw d'Artagnan. D'Artagnan stood up and turned to the door. When he saw who it was at the door, he gave out a cry of excitement. It was the dark stranger of Meung. D'Artagnan jumped forward and pulled out his sword.
At last,
he yelled with a smile.
This time you will not escape from me. I did not come to fight, mister,
the stranger replied.
I have come in the name of the king to arrest you. What?
D'Artagnan exclaimed.
Who are you? I am the Comte de Rochefort, and I have been ordered to take you to the cardinal.
D'Artagnan stood in his place for a moment and then put away his sword. He smiled and said lightly,
You may take me to the cardinal, but I will still fight you one day.
The two men got into a carriage and rode to the cardinal's palace, where d'Artagnan followed Rochefort up to the cardinal's library. The cardinal was sitting at his desk writing. He looked up and told Rochefort to leave, then stared at d'Artagnan for a long time.
"Mister,"
he said,
"I have written the order for your arrest. Do you know why?" "No, sir. The only thing I have done that I could be arrested for you still do not know."
Richelieu again stared at the young man.
"Mr. d'Artagnan,"
he began,
"you came to Paris about 8 months ago to become a musketeer and find your fortune in the world. On the way here, you rode through the town of Meung, where you met Rochefort and started a fight. I don't know what else happened there, but it was something. Mister,"
said d'Artagnan,
"that man stole my—" "I don't care,"
the cardinal interrupted.
"In Meung you lost a letter you were carrying. It was a recommendation to Mr. Treville. In your time in Paris you have done many things. You rode on horse, for example, with your musketeer friends towards the coast, but they were all stopped on the road, while you continued on your journey. Yes, you have done many things in these last few months. And now, Mr. d'Artagnan, you are arrested for having given secrets of France to England, to the Duke of Buckingham, for instance. And who can prove what you say, sir?"
D'Artagnan asked calmly.
"The only person who might know of my actions has herself been punished."
The cardinal looked surprised.
"Whom do you mean?" "Milady, the Countess de la Fère."
The cardinal jumped to his feet when he heard the name.
"Tell me, young man, who has punished her?"
he asked angrily.
"We have, sir, my friends and myself." "Did you put her in prison, then?" "She is dead." "Dead?"
screamed the cardinal, as if he could not believe it.
"Are you saying that you killed her?" "She murdered the young woman I loved. We took her, judged her crimes, and killed her."
D'Artagnan then told the cardinal of how Milady had poisoned Constance Bonacieux, of the trial and the execution.
"So,"
began the cardinal,
"you acted as judges? You forget that those who kill without being a real judge are murderers." "We are not, sir,"
replied d'Artagnan quietly,
"since I have a letter of permission in my pocket." "Permission? Signed by whom? By the king?"
Great anger came across the cardinal's face.
"No,"
replied d'Artagnan.
"Signed by you." "Me? Young man, you are crazy." "Sir, you will certainly recognize your own writing."
D'Artagnan then took a letter from his pocket paper, which the cardinal read aloud.
October 13th, 1626. It is by my permission and for the good of France that the man holding this letter has killed who he has killed. Richelieu.
The cardinal sat thinking for a long time. He read the paper again and again. Then he slowly tore it in small pieces.
"Now I am in great trouble,"
thought d'Artagnan. The cardinal picked up a pen, wrote a few lines on a piece of paper, and signed his name on it.
"I will certainly go to prison, at least,"
thought d'Artagnan sadly.
"Take this,"
the cardinal said suddenly, handing d'Artagnan the piece of paper.
"I have taken your paper and changed it with this one. The name on the letter is still missing. I will let you write it in."
D'Artagnan read the piece of paper and could not believe what he saw. The letter was a promotion to become a captain in the Musketeers. He dropped down onto one knee.
"Sir,"
he began,
"I should not receive this letter. I have 3 friends. They are also musketeers, and they are better than I. You are a man of great courage, Mr. d'Artagnan,"
the cardinal said, smiling at how quickly he had changed his enemy into a friend.
"I admire strong and brave men. You may do anything you wish with this letter of promotion. Just remember that I have given this letter to you to make the choice. I will never forget your kindness,"
replied d'Artagnan. The cardinal turned to the door and called,
"Rochefort!"
Rochefort entered immediately.
"Rochefort,"
the cardinal began,
"Mr. d'Artagnan is now my good friend. Do not fight with one another. Shake hands and become friends if you value living."
The two men shook hands, greeted each other politely, and smiled to the cardinal. They then left the room together.
"We will have the opportunity to meet again, shall we not, Mr. d'Artagnan?"
said Rochefort as soon as the door was closed.
"Soon,"
answered d'Artagnan.
"I will be ready,"
said Rochefort.
"Did I hear you two talking?"
said the cardinal, opening the door. Again the two men shook hands, smiled at each other, and bowed to the cardinal. D'Artagnan ran quickly to Athos' rooms. He told Athos everything that had happened when he saw the cardinal. After finishing his story, he held out the promotion letter and said,
"This, of course, should be yours."
Athos smiled at d'Artagnan and shook his head.
"No, my friend,"
he said.
"This job is too much for Athos and too little for the Comte de la Fère. You should keep it. It has cost you enough."
D'Artagnan bowed and left Athos. Next he went to see Porthos. Porthos greeted him dressed in a wonderful and fancy suit of clothes, looking happily at himself in a mirror.
"Well,"
Porthos asked,
"do you like my new clothes?" "They are very wonderful,"
d'Artagnan replied.
"But I have come here to offer you a suit of clothes that will look even better on you. The clothes of a captain of the Musketeers."
D'Artagnan then showed Porthos the promotion letter.
"My dear friend,"
said Porthos,
"this letter is of no use to me. While we are away in Bethune, a beautiful and rich lady who I know has lost her husband. In a year, when enough time has passed, I will be married to her. You should write your own name on the letter, for I am finished with fighting."
D'Artagnan then went to see Aramis. He found him sitting alone and praying. D'Artagnan told his story once again and offered the promotion to Aramis. Aramis shook his head.
"D'Artagnan,"
he said,
"our recent adventures have changed me. I have become unhappy with the life of the fighter. I have decided to become a religious man and work for the church. You keep this letter. You will make a brave captain."
D'Artagnan again went to see Athos, whom he found sitting quietly and staring into a glass of wine.
"I see,"
said Athos, with a smile,
"that Porthos and Aramis have also refused your letter."
He reached for a pen and wrote D'Artagnan's name on the paper and returned it to him.
"I will now become a captain,"
D'Artagnan said with a sad voice.
"but it seems that I will not often see my good friends any more. I will be left with only bad memories. You are still young,"
replied Athos,
"and all your bad memories will be changed into sweet ones one day."
Epilogue. D'Artagnan became a captain of the Musketeers. Porthos married the rich woman and lived richly and happily. Aramis left Paris and became a monk in the countryside. Athos remained a musketeer for a few more years, when he retired and moved to a small house in the country. D'Artagnan fought Rochefort 3 times and wounded him 3 times.
"The next time I shall probably kill you,"
he said, as he helped Rochefort stand up.
"Then it is better for me that we stop fighting,"
replied Rochefort,
"and let us become friends instead."